Well, let me first offer a word of welcome to each of you here this afternoon, to speakers, to faculty, to students, and invited guests. The topic of this symposium, Middle Ground, Middle East, Religious Sites and Urban Contexts, could not come at a more opportune time. Consider the recent interreligious tensions in Alexandria and Cairo between the Coptic and Islamic communities, or the debates surrounding the proposed Islamic Center in Manhattan, or last year's Swiss referendum on minarets, or the current uneasiness in the city of Beirut. Each of these situations points towards the importance of our taking into account the ways that a resurgence of religious identity is playing itself out in urban environments and those of the Middle East in particular. Indeed, despite the homogenizing forces of globalization, the distinctiveness fostered by religious commitments seems only to have strengthened in recent decades. Jürgen Habermas has noted that this phenomenon calls into question what he terms the secularization hypothesis, that increasing material wealth necessarily diminishes the role of religious identity. Indeed, Habermas now speaks of a post-secular age in which political and social movements are powerfully shaped by religious conviction, in part as a means of resistance to the ubiquity of market capitalism. Habermas's perspective could be taken as the starting point for the discussions that we will have together today and tomorrow. This interest is reflected, for example, not only in the recent articles in the New York Times addressing the protection and restoration of ancient cities and large-scale projects in such religiously evocative areas as the Middle East, but also extends surely to include the recent focus in certain advanced studios here at the Yale School of Architecture, which have addressed themes such as the 21st century mosque or the re-envisioning of a sacred fishing site for the First Nations peoples of Ontario. Underlying the theme of the symposium, therefore, is a renewed appreciation for aspects of urban form that continue to speak of a center of reference drawn from the longer beliefs and commitments that have shaped human history and which continue to form our respective patterns of cultural identity and social memory. So could I have the first image, please, the next one? There we go. Such an appreciation, of course, is not without precedent. In 1976, for example, the historian Joseph Rickwert wrote in The Idea of a Town that the recognizable textures of public open space and other conspicuous institutions are often about symbolic patterns constructed on the basis of beliefs and rituals. Principal institutions of a town, he said, its walls and gates, its central shrines and public spaces are all part of the generative myths that define particular communities. Echoing Rickwert, the Dutch architect Aldo van Eyck further suggested that modern architects had forgotten this essential element of urban life, that the city is not just a rational solution to the problems of production, marketing, circulation, and hygiene, or an automatic response to the pressures of certain physical and market forces. But indeed, the city is also a means of enshrining the hopes and fears of its citizens. Here at Yale, this conviction has been forcefully advanced for a generation by the work of Vincent Scully, who demonstrated time and again that since the ancients, cities have been shaped by holy precincts that served as anchors around which all else revolved. From pyramids and temples to spires and minarets, in an evaluative sense, these spiritually charged urban forms have to do with how we understand ourselves both as individuals and as a society, as well as our place in the natural order. So most importantly, however, these spiritually motivated urban forms represent a sedimentation in the city that asserts an historical dimension within which even the most contemporary events occur. To discuss religious spaces in urban context, as we propose to do here, therefore, it made sense for this conference to focus on the Middle East as a region where convincingly yet related religious traditions have been intertwined for generations. A region where the layering of the cultures of the three Abrahamic faiths has long been characteristic of the region's social identities and heritages. To engage such a multifaceted mosaic are the cities of the Middle East. Our symposium speakers themselves represent not only divergent backgrounds, but also a diversity of professional profiles. They are architects, scholars, and intellectuals. They are drawn from a variety of academic fields and schools, from theology and art history to architecture and cultural preservation. The list includes figures from Beirut to Great Britain, Riyadh to Jordan, New York to Istanbul, Canada to North Africa, and Berkeley to Alexandria. Most of these individuals are actively engaged in the teaching of architecture, its history, or in anthropology, social or religious studies. Yet others build work that influences thousands, if not millions, of individuals. The accumulated influence is significant and difficult to ignore. So over the course of this symposium, we will thus hear religious sites in urban contexts described in a variety of ways, as an omen of a modern medievalism, as a cultural model representing a layering of religious traditions, as a political and social means of territorial occupation, as related to the secularization of time, or as a paradoxically globalized commodity. We will hear of the cities of Cairo and Alexandria, Jerusalem, Riyadh, Tel Aviv, and some speakers will explore the post-war redevelopment of Beirut, a city which has the highest concentration of religious buildings anywhere in the world. Some will see religious sites as part of a pattern of cultural and heritage construction. Others may argue that these spaces increasingly contribute to the polarization of communities and stoke unrest, with the rising diversity of faith groups challenging established notions of citizenship, the nation, and the state. Each of us will thereby be challenged by some deeper questions regarding modernization and its relationship to tradition. If, for example, a characteristic of religious conviction is a strong sense of indebtedness to a reality which precedes the autonomous individual of modernity, then how might we shape our understanding of the social reality of the city? How, in other words, is my relationship to a fellow citizen shaped by a common awareness that before we come on the scene, there is already a web of relationships, including to the sacred, that shapes the contours of our relationship with one another? The various approaches to the topic of the religious site in an urban context should turn us back to the symposium's title, Middle Ground, Middle East, a title which was first suggested by Makram El-Kadi, my colleague. It evokes, I believe, both some form of commonality as well as alluding to that which divides. We will not, presumably, move in our discussion into in-depth political debates beyond the obvious need to focus on architectural and spatial issues. We are invited, nevertheless, as participants in this event, to think carefully about expansive ways of considering sacred sites today and the powerful influence that they have in shaping the environments in which we live. In closing, then, let me just briefly thank the many individuals who have been important to shaping this symposium, especially my colleagues Makram El-Kadi, Barbara Shaler, Salama Shaker, Galeb Abdul Rahman, my students here at the school, especially Gary Koo and Gregory Melitonov. Not only is the theme of the conference ecumenical in nature, but its sponsorship too is collaborative. It's a collaborative initiative of the Yale School of Architecture, the Divinity School, the Institute of Sacred Music, and the Council of Middle East Studies. And we are grateful for the support of each of these schools and programs, and to their deans and directors, Robert A.M. Stern, Harold Attridge, Martin Jean, and Marcia Inhorn. And now I'm going to turn and introduce our first speaker, Nazar Al-Sayad. Our first speaker, should I go ahead and introduce him and then we'll set it up? Yeah. Our first speaker is Nazar Al-Sayad, Professor of Architecture, Planning, and Urban History at the University of California at Berkeley, and chair of the university's Center for Middle Eastern Studies and director of its International and Area Studies Division. Professor Al-Sayad is an architect, a planner, an urban designer, and urban historian, a graduate of Cairo University, from which he holds a Bachelor of Science in Architectural Engineering and Diploma in Town Planning. Professor Al-Sayad also holds an MS in Architecture from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a PhD in Architectural History from UC Berkeley. As a scholar, Professor Al-Sayad is the author and editor of many books and articles related to today's topics, including Streets of Islamic Cairo, Dwellings, Settlements, and Tradition, Consuming Tradition, Manufacturing Heritage, and his most recent co-edited book, The Fundamentalist City, Religiosity and the Remaking of Urban Space, published just this fall. So please welcome Professor Al-Sayad, who will present the opening paper of this symposium titled The Fundamentalist City, Reflections on a Medieval Modernity.
Choose this to advance the slides.
You wanna keep this?
They'll start when you start, but just use this to advance the slides. Thanks.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for being here, and thank you, Carla, for this introduction. This conference, by its very definition, posits what I consider to be an impossible equation: middle ground, Middle East. Its title captures the mood of the current global moment, pregnant as it may be with both the despair that religious conflict and political extremism have wrought, particularly to many cities in the Middle East, and also the hope that some middle ground may be reached precisely in that same place. The Middle East, by definition, is a difficult and an ever-changing geography. Middle of where and east of what? In fact, it is almost the only world region, for those of us who are in area studies, whose name is not linked to a given geography or territory. It's not Southeast Asia or Latin America. And in a sense, one could ask, it is in fact a region whose definition emerged and was sustained from elsewhere. So how can it possibly offer a middle ground? I hope that my talk today, loaded as it may be with political undertones, will not cast a pessimistic shadow on the hopeful statement implied in your conference description. But I'm going to try to keep my hopes up despite the pessimism of my position. It is now clear, regardless of what region one studies, that globalization and the compression of space and time have fundamentally changed the standard relationship between peoples and places. Across the world, however, and despite these trends, it is also clear that national, communal, and specifically religious allegiances have often become much stronger. Some scholars argue that such strengthening ties are an important means of resistance against the hegemonic forces of globalization. Others interpret the rise of religious practices as articulating alternative forms of non-Western modernity. Whatever the case, the unanticipated resurgence of religious and ethnic loyalties, particularly in the last 2 decades of the 20th century, has given new meaning to religion in the public sphere for many communities. Indeed, Christianity, Hinduism, Judaism, and Islam have all experienced such surges in commitment and in practice. And in many instances, radical groups espousing essentialist religious doctrines have spawned new political movements. The spread of global terrorism has often been explained in terms of the inability to understand these groups. But such a connection is often unjustified, and it would be a grave simplification to view all religious orthodoxy, or even fundamentalisms, and I always use fundamentalisms with an S here, as a basis for terrorist violence. It is my hope that this conference, with its focus on religious sites, will make this point emphatically. Speaking as an urbanist, what does any of this have to do with the urban condition? Well, religious groups, and more recently, those affiliated with orthodox ideologies, have also been increasingly called upon to provide social services in these marginalized communities as their needs have been left unattended by state bureaucracies. The breakdown of state power under the neoliberal economic paradigm that has swept the world in the last, again, 2 decades or so of the 20th century has often created a vacuum that was quickly filled by religious groups and religious societies. There is a considerable disagreement among urban theorists on how to interpret today's urban landscape. On the one hand, an optimistic discourse envisions cities as arenas of livability and of social transformation, particularly in settings like Latin America, where there is a sense that the decentralization of governance from national to the urban scale involved a quiet evolution of democracy. On the other hand, another critical discourse sees the emerging forms of urban citizenship as fragmented and splintered, constituted through gated enclaves and exclusionary spaces. Democracy, in Oren Yaftachel's provocative theorization, and drawing mainly from the case of Israel-Palestine, comes to be territorialized in, and I quote, urban ethnocracy, a form of governance marked by deep ethnic and religious division. How should we begin to sort through these starkly different interpretations of cities and citizenship? I will try to explore some of these issues in my talk, which is divided into 2 parts, as my title suggests: the fundamentalist city and medieval modernity, engaging also with a few religious sites. In fact, some of the sites that Carla mentioned in the introduction. I initiated a project at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. a few years ago, about 5 years ago, called Cities and Fundamentalism, with the aim of understanding some of these issues with a particular focus on the question of how and when does the performance of religious beliefs or rituals turn into exclusionary spatial practices. The project, in fact, resulted in the edited book titled The Fundamentalist City, and I absolutely have to stress here the question mark in it, which was just published a few months ago. The relationship between fundamentalism and urbanism is very complex. Few today would dispute that in the current moment that fundamentalism has a negative connotation, associated mainly with militancy and regressive politics. However, if one were to actually check in the dictionary, you will discover that the Oxford English Dictionary simply defines fundamentalism as the strict maintenance of orthodox traditional beliefs or doctrines. What we tend to classify today as fundamentalism is often constructed as a form of religiosity in direct conflict with secularism. In reality, the concept of fundamentalism has a Christian origin. The term was actually first used in the early 20th century when the American Northern Baptist Convention in 1921 described the more conservative evangelical Protestant delegates who stressed the inerrancy of the Bible and mandated its use as a binding historical document as fundamentalists. In fact, I actually worked very hard to get you the cover of Time magazine from 1923, which covered the fundamentalist movement in America back then, but unfortunately, of all of their archives, that cover is missing. I don't know if that's deliberate or not. Emerson and Hartman, who actually studied also some of this stuff, suggested that in the broad sweep of history, fundamentalists are actually normal. There is nothing unusual in people taking religion very seriously. What we now regard as religious extremism was commonplace less than 200 years ago in the Western world, and it still is commonplace in many parts of the globe. This is just a reminder that fundamentalism has not always been viewed as an oppressive system of belief. What has changed, however, in modern life is simply the way that it is being viewed with the introduction of a new value system offering a different vantage point. This new perspective emerged as a result of the colonial project of the 18th and 19th century, which spread the ideas of the European Enlightenment with its focus on the individual to parts of the world that for centuries had abided by a different system. The Enlightenment project advocated a new frame of reference which assumed that all human beings share the same universal values. And by the mid-20th century or so, the people of many colonized regions invoked the same value system to justify their rebellion against their colonial masters, to engage in independent struggles, and to establish themselves as new nation-states. Their various forms of resistance ranged from appeals to the humanity of their oppressors, to invocations of religious principles, to sometimes desperate extremist violence. But during this period, no one ever describes such movements as fundamentalists. And after the dust from independence struggles settled, many of these new nations adopted the same modernist governance structures of their former colonizers. As such, however, they soon found themselves having to battle some of the same groups which had helped them achieve independence in the first place, but which were now rebelling against the Enlightenment-inspired universalism. These groups usually advocated a return to a real or an imagined former value system and a revival of mechanisms of decision-making from the past that have often been associated with religion. The rise of information technology and globalization, coupled with the re-emergence of religious activism, aggravated the situation. As Manuel Castells argued a few years ago in The Power of Identity, the space of flows, which replaced, if you will, the space of places, facilitated the rise of such fundamentalist movements, not only in the newly independent states, but also in the land of the former colonizers. And as Benjamin Barber pointed out in his book, Jihad versus Macworld, many nations in this new global order want it all. Despite the obvious contradictions, they want the Coca-Cola, McDonald's, and the internet, while at the same time they insist on restricting freedoms of speech, movement, communication, and sometimes even food. Tim Mitchell, on the other hand, argued that jihad is not antithetical, if you will, to the development of Macworld, and that Macworld is really what he calls Mac Jihad, a necessary combination of a variety of social logics and forces. Indeed, he points out that jihad seems to have ridden on the back of the information revolution and has done extremely well by it. And of course, we know from the experience of 9/11, that's exactly what Al-Qaeda had managed to do very successfully. Hence, developments in many cities and places that we refer to today as tolerating fundamentalism are in fact a product of a specific moment in time facilitated by the space of flows. In one of the earliest works on fundamentalism, in fact, a book titled Defenders of God, Bruce Lawrence argued that, and I quote, "Fundamentalism is an ideology rather than a theology that is principally formed in conflict with modernity," end quote. Now, I will take issue a bit with that statement, although it does resonate in certain parts of the world. Martin Marty and Scott Appleby were among the first to recognize the upsurge of fundamentalism in the early 1990s. In fact, they started their project in 1989. In an initiative that was supported by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, they convened a large group of 100 scholars from all religious scholars of different religious affiliations, who studied the phenomena over a 5-year period and in fact produced very impressive volumes, I think 6 volumes altogether. They concluded that there's a family of resemblance within fundamentalism that to a greater or lesser degree unites movements within the religious traditions of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, and Buddhism. But today, it would be naive to think that fundamentalism exists in complete opposition to the modern world or its various manifestations. Indeed, the category itself can be defined less by a rejection of modernity than by social, ethnic, and nationalistic grievances that have to do with a particular understanding of the past. One reading of this paradox might be that the relationship between modernity and fundamentalism is less antagonistic than transactional. And I'll try to explain that as I go further with my talk. According to some, fundamentalism is the rational response of a traditionally religious people to social and political and economic changes that have downgraded and constrained the role of religion in public life. The case is best illustrated through the challenges to the Israeli state by the Israeli settler movement in the occupied West Bank, and more recently by the problems that the Palestinian Authority has actually faced with the takeover of Gaza by Hamas. In some of these cases, the conflict is between two or more usually antagonistic understandings of regimes of knowledge and understandings of statehood. But here we must recognize that such conflicts are not just battles between fundamentalism and secularism. They are often between two irreconcilable forms of essential ideas. But should fundamentalism really be understood as a new type of modern resistance then? It is true that most fundamentalist movements invoke an invented history to justify their claims. But it's also true that almost all nationalist movements have done the same in earlier times. The only difference may be that fundamentalists always invoke an essentialist history that is based on the belief of the inerrancy of a given text or texts, and hence they justify a notion of God, or a nation of God, or a city of God, by invoking scriptural truth, while in fact the nation state simply invokes only the apparent truth of its own modernity. So let me move on to the territorial character of fundamentalism. One might hypothesize that there are two versions of the fundamentalist city, the parochial and the global. The parochial fundamentalist city is one where mainly local forces have shaped the fundamentalist exclusionary nature of space. One may cite here, for example, the case of the city of Peshawar in northern Pakistan under the Taliban influence, or parts of Hebron, which are controlled by the settler movement in the West Bank. The global fundamentalist city, if you will, is one where networks of global interaction allow for a high level of exclusionary spatial practices, but one that are tied much more to a larger global network of commercial exchange. Examples here may include ethnic neighborhoods in both the cities of the Islamic Global South as well as the cities of the Global North, which have sizable religious minority populations. Now, the relationship between the city and its hinterland in the fundamentalist equation is an important one, and one that is relatively unexplored by scholars of either religious studies or urban studies. This core-periphery relationship, which in certain cases describes the connection between city and desert, and in others between city and village, if you will, may explain much about the roots of various fundamentalisms. Two examples of the first type are the 18th century Wahhabism in Central Arabia, which was reincarnated in the 20th century during the events that accompanied the siege of Mecca of 1979. This is actually an extremely important episode in the Islamic world, and one that did not receive its adequate attention, both in the Muslim world as well as in the West. And of course, the other one was the cultish movement, which is called Jama'at Takfir wal Hijra in Egypt, whose activities culminated in the rise of the fundamentalist Muslim groups in Egypt in the early 80s and continuing on until today. Both of these movements, which I will talk about a bit extensively, played on a special and mutually reinforcing relationship between the city and its desert hinterland, in which plans concocted in the latter, assumed to be a space of virtue and purity, were executed in the former, condemned as a place of vice and infidelity. Wahhabism as a sect is attributed to Muhammad Abdul Wahhab. Many of you have been hearing about Wahhabism since 9/11, a term that didn't even exist almost, if you will, in the English language until then. An 18th century figure from what is today Saudi Arabia. Wahhabi theology treats the Quran and the Hadith as the only fundamental and authoritative texts. Some 30 years ago, a group of Wahhabi militants laid siege to Islam's holiest mosque in Mecca. led by a young man who believed himself to be the promised Mahdi who came to cleanse the earth of sin and to bring the kingdom of God to man. In fact, the siege lasted 21 days, during which the entire Saudi government was totally paralyzed, and that holy site, accessible to all Muslims, was not accessible to any. The siege of Mecca, which occurred on November 30th, 1979, the first morning of a new Muslim century according to the Hijri calendar, launched the first global jihad and later contributed to the founding of Al-Qaeda. In fact, if you go back, and there's a beautiful book on that called The Siege of Mecca, which highlights the names of individuals who engaged in that siege. If you compare that list to the list of the 15 hijackers of 9/11 who came from Saudi Arabia, you would be astounded at the similarity. They came supposedly from exactly the same families. The connection between the city in which the action occurred and the desert which served as a training ground was important for the siege of Mecca in the late 20th century, as it was for the rise of Wahhabism in the first place a century later. Jama'at al-Takfir al-Hijra, which is the other group that I'm talking about, was originally founded in Egypt, emerging in the 1960s as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. They considered the Muslim Brotherhood, which has been, at least in the past 20 years or so, the main opposition group in Egypt, too benign. Members of this group were Islamists who claimed not to be bound by the usual religious constraints. Although they were originally ambivalent about the city and migrated to the desert to perform what they called hijrah in the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, they were always interested in returning to the city. And the opportunity for them came with the plot to assassinate Egyptian President Anwar Sadat in 1981 after his peace treaty with Israel. They believed that the ends justify the means, and hence, in this case, for the year or so before that assassination, they were willing to adopt non-Islamic appearances to blend in with the Cairene crowds and make themselves hard to detect from the police. Another example that demonstrates that this relationship between the city and the countryside may be the role of the village and the small town in the events in India around the Godhra train burning, which led to the Gujarat riots of 2002. The Gujarat riots and the repercussions, such as the communal violence that occurred in Mumbai, have often been represented worldwide in media accounts as a clash between Hindu fundamentalists and Muslim fundamentalists. A predictable outcome, of course, of the fundamentalist ethos motivated by religious zeal. However, the question remains, particularly for us as urbanists. Why did events in small, unimportant rural towns like Godhra or Ayodhya find their most violent repercussions in some of India's largest cities, like Ahmedabad or Mumbai? Ordinarily, the question of urban space has been peripheral in the understanding of this incident and of fundamentalism as a phenomenon altogether. In fact, when urban space is referred to, particularly in political accounts, it is usually only as a tableau against which fundamentalism is played out. Yet, in an essay reflecting on the rioting in Mumbai following the destruction of the Babri Masjid in 1992, Arjun Apodarai claimed that the violence perpetuated against Muslims was in fact motivated by the desire of Hindus to claim valuable urban resources such as property and water, and that this could only be achieved through what he called the elimination of Muslim bodies, end quote. In other words, fundamentalism served as the pretext for a large campaign of land grabbing in which Muslims were seen as undeserving of urban space or urban resources. One way to understand the fundamentalist city, then, beyond the lens of religious activism, is to interrogate it through the practices of exclusion. And this allows us to ask, what makes a city a fundamentalist city, and in whose eyes? From this important question follow a number of ancillary questions, like, is a city which deprives a particular gender of access to its streets a fundamentalist city? Is a city which requires religious minorities to observe and obey the practices and dress codes of its majority a fundamentalist city? Is a city which bans smoking and renders smokers a banished group, like my own city, Berkeley, does, a fundamentalist city? When is this line crossed? As a working hypothesis, and to flesh out this discourse, let me suggest that the fundamentalist city has a few hypothetical attributes. It is a city which categorically excludes, by law, tradition, declared policy, or latent practice, individuals who are adherent to other religions or who belong to a different ethnicity than those of a ruling power or the majority population. It is a city whose minority residents belonging to different ethnic or religious groups are denied access to basic urban services or specific public spaces. It is a city whose religious minority mandates, whose religious majority mandates or practically expects that the minority groups will conform to all the rituals of public behavior described and prescribed by the religious code of the majority. It is a city which normalizes most of the above-mentioned forms of control or oppression in everyday life to the point that the minority ceases to question them anymore. Of course, these are hypothetical attributes, and in a sense, they describe a theoretical, generic fundamentalist city that does not exist in any given site. And I think here it is important for me to also provide some important qualifications which relate to the distinction between what I would call ultra-traditionalists and fundamentalists. Some may argue that there is no difference, but I would suggest that the difference may simply be one of space and location. For example, the Amish in parts of the East Coast, particularly Pennsylvania, are ultra-traditionalists, cannot be described as fundamentalists, like, if you will, Hamas. This is supposedly so because they mind their own business. They hope to be left alone in their insular pastoral settings, do not cross-stellarize, and are not antagonistic to the state. And in fact, they do not necessarily seek to change the nation or enforce their views on it. Of course, others may argue that the real difference between the Amish and Hamas is simply that the former happens to be rural people, while the latter exists in a very small territory that is only one big city or one big ghetto. So let me now move to the second part of my talk and to discuss the practices of exclusion. To do so, I will invoke the metaphor of medieval modernity to theorize these phenomena in a broader context beyond the Middle East. I will focus on three paradigmatic types: the gated enclave, the regulated squatter settlement, and the camp. All three are generic spaces of what I call a fundamentalist ethos. I will attempt to unpack the increasingly fragmented forms of urban citizenship, not only with reference to religiosity, but rather in the context of the neoliberal ideology that has swept the world in the last 2 decades, as I mentioned earlier. Indeed, neoliberalism has created a splintered urbanism, as coined by Graham and Marvin, whose patterns exceed the practices of simple segregation or exclusion based on religion. Instead, it introduced multiple and competing sovereignties, which, when territorially exercised, produce fiefdoms of regulations, or, as they called it, zones of no law, end quote. I employed the conceptual framework of medieval modernity with all of its paradoxes here, not as a historical period or era, but rather as an analytical tool. And this is very important for me methodologically. This direction expands on work that I've done with my colleague Anani Roy at Berkeley in a paper that has gained much currency because it went really beyond the traditional bounds of regional specificity and attempted to create a wider theoretical framework to view some of these developments around the world. In that paper, we argued that there are 3 points of conversion between the medieval and the contemporary city, if you will, particularly in relationship to the condition of splintering urbanism. First, if modern citizenship was constituted through a set of abstract individual rights embedded in the concept of the nation-state, then now there is the emergence of forms of citizenship that are located in urban enclaves, or what some have called enclave urbanism, which exists in abundance in the Middle East, both in its rich countries and its poor countries. As in medieval times, this citizenship is linked to either religious patronage, as in the bishop, or to associational membership, as in the guilds. In both cases, it is fundamentally about protection. Second, such forms of citizenship substitute for or are even hostile to the state. From the private homeowners association to Tea Party activists who now often invoke religion, and to the neighborhood level Islamic republics declared by religious fundamentalist groups in parts of the Middle East. These are private systems of governance that operate as medieval fiefdoms, imposing truth and norms that are often contradictory and contrary in their spirit and their application to national law, the national law of the nation state. The city comes to be articulated in what Holston and Apudarai have termed, in this case, a honeycomb of jurisdictions, a medieval body of overlapping, heterogeneous, non-uniform, and increasingly private memberships, end quote. In cities from Los Angeles to Cairo, the most common paradigm of spatial organization for the upper and upper middle classes has been the gated enclave, the first type of space which is often maintained through elaborate techniques of surveillance, policing, and architectural design. Not only are these residential spaces walled and gated, but they're also linked to other spaces of exclusion, such as urban mega projects and leisure developments. It is in this bundling of urban spaces of seduction and safety that I would like to concentrate. They are successionary patterns of spaces held together through premium network infrastructure. I do not need to elaborate on this, as most of you are familiar with these kinds of developments, particularly in the context of the West. But I would like to add that such developments in many parts of the Middle East, and indeed even in the United States, have allowed not only for the exclusion of others based on income or class, but also for a retrenchment of groups which discriminate based on religious affiliation or practice. Gated compounds that mandate, for example, that you have to wear a veil. And they are starting to occur in parts of Egypt. I was shocked on a trip to Cairo very recently to discover that there are now restaurants that do not allow veiled women in, contrary, in fact, to the policy of the Egyptian state. The fundamentalism of these communities lies in their capacity and their desire to create a distinctive territorialization of citizenship. Today, gated enclaves can be understood in relationship to medieval urbanism and the formation of the charter town. Here we may remember Henri Perren's famous argument about medieval cities, that the air of the city makes free, end quote. Freedom in the Middle Ages was an attribute as inseparable from the rank of citizen of a city as it is in our day with the nation state. The key elements of this freedom included personal liberty, as in freedom from feudal serfdom, and freedom of land, as in the freedom to transfer and convey property. It was the city charter that bestowed these freedoms, creating a legal, distinct entity, if you will, whereby a distinction is made where one lives in a corporate town for a day and a year, remove the obligation of serfdom. The most significant implication of using the medieval urbanism as a tool to analyze contemporary cities rests on understanding the concept of freedom then. First, this freedom was mainly utilitarian. Perren writes, nothing was further from the mind of the original middle classes in the Middle Ages than any conception of the right of man and citizen. Personal liberty itself was not claimed as a natural right. It was sought only for the advantages that it conferred, end quote. Second, the charter, the medieval charter, was inherently exclusionary. Its benefits, such as the proceeds of communal taxes or the protection of the penal code, could only extend to those living within the chartered enclave. The urban middle class then became, like the clergy and the nobility, a privileged order with special legal and territorial modalities that allowed it to preserve its exceptional status and associated benefits to the exclusion of the mass of rural inhabitants. Back then, freedom was a monopoly. Despite the differences in scale, it is possible to compare today's homeowner associations with the medieval chartered enclave. Today, property matters in the way that occupation mattered in the Middle Ages. In both cases, urban citizenship is premised on the management of the successionary spaces of and from the city. And just like the gated communities outside of Cairo, like this one I'm showing you entitled Dreamland, residents often feel that they have rights that they cannot enjoy in the nation whose citizenship they actually hold. In discussing similar entities in medieval times, Perrin noted, and I quote, "If they had the power, they would have everywhere become states within a state themselves." The parallels are indeed here very clear. The second type of space that I think we need to look at a bit is the squatter settlement. Throughout history, squatting has been an important mechanism of settling the land, almost everywhere in the world. We called it homesteading in the United States, not squatting. Today, squatter settlements constitute a considerable portion of the built environment in the cities of the Global South, particularly in the Middle East, often reaching in some Middle Eastern cities 50% of the entire fabric of these cities. And they accommodate the majority of the urban poor. Of course, with the deepening of neoliberal austerity policies, non-state actors have emerged as the de facto state in informal settlements. Most striking is the convergence of these informal geographies and the territorialization of religious fundamentalism. With the withdrawal of the state from social spending programs, religious fundamentalist groups have become the main provider of urban services in many of these informal settlements. One of the key sites at which such processes became first sharply evident, at least to me, is in the district of Mbaba in Cairo in the early 1990s. In 1992, the Egyptian army had to storm Mbaba, ending the rule of an Islamist group called Al-Jama'ah al-Islamiyya, which had also declared Mbaba, if you will, to be a state within a state, the Islamic Republic of Mbaba. How did an Islamist group establish this zone of sovereignty? The answer partly lies in neoliberal restructuring. Egypt's quite strict adherence to the rules of structural adjustment that were imposed by the likes of the World Bank had boded ill for much of its urban poor, particularly in cities like Cairo. In neighborhoods like Mbaba, there has been a sharp increase in poverty and in informal employment at that time. Comprised of dilapidated public housing projects and squatter settlements in the late 1970s, Mbaba was in fact the site of the first bread riots that were triggered by the IMF austerity policies. By the 1980s, Mbaba had been taken over by the Jama'ah Islamiyya, this same group that I talked about, a group also linked to the assassination of Anwar Sadat, which came to be the de facto state. On the one hand, it provided almost all social services, from healthcare to education. On the other hand, it divided Mbaba into 10 sections, each ruled by an emir, governing according to fundamentalist interpretations of Islam. For its short-lived life, which actually wasn't very short because it lasted for more than a year and a half, the Islamic Republic of Mbaba was indeed a fundamentalist city whose traces remain in the Mbaba of today. Ironically, Anwar Sadat, known to have been, in fact, a devout Muslim, was later buried on the same spot where he was assassinated, under the memorial of the Egyptian unknown soldier. This structure was already built in the shape of a negative pyramid, if you will, invoking the longer history of pharaonic Egypt, but in this case, with the names of the October War dead carved on it. In a twist of irony, its symbolic shape unintentionally provided further justification to Sadat's fundamentalist assassins that he was, and I quote, the last pharaoh of Egypt, end quote, as they had always called him. Mbaba is not an exception. In Lebanon, Hezbollah, a group that is high on the US post-9/11 list of terrorist organizations, despite the fact that it has been completely normalized as a political party in Lebanon, is also a de facto state. Its development programs in the southern suburbs of Beirut include the provision of housing through Jihad al-Bina or Jihad for Construction, and they have other programs in education, medical services, water, sewage systems, and electricity, all of that. And as Beirut is remade through elaborate urban projects such as Solidaire or El Yassar, so Hezbollah has emerged as the main mediator of housing rights for the Shia urban poor. Its rise to power can only be understood in the context of civil war Beirut, where the city was divided into various zones, each governed by a religious militia, which was not only a war machine, but also an apparatus of service provision and development. Today, Hezbollah has the capacity to topple the entire Lebanese regime, as we have seen from the events of last week. In Mumbai, Hindu fundamentalist groups like the Shiv Sena have won popularity at the urban scale by promising to reclaim space in the city's absurdly tight housing market. This fundamentalist ethos, or the fundamentalist ethos in this case, is reflected in the attempt to engage in this erasure of entire Muslim communities. Komarov and Komarov designate these religious regimes to be hallmarks of neoliberal capitalism, a privatization of the millennium through the creation of parastates and religious states, and a reformation of citizenship as conditional, partial, and situational, end quote. Here, once again, the medieval proves a useful analytical framework to analyze such contemporary processes. Before I move to my conclusion, let me also talk about the final paradigmatic example. Let me reflect on where we are in the world today as I see it and how it relates to our discussion of religious sites. The current moment can be interpreted as a moment of transition, with empire looming large on the horizon. In recent years, there has been a growing sense that neoliberal globalization is transmuting into imperial globalization, or at least revealing its inevitably imperial character. One of the most debated accounts of empire is that provided by Hart and Negri in a beautiful and important book called Empire, published almost a decade ago. In their influential analysis, they argue that today's empire is a decentered and deterritorialized apparatus of rule, as we have learned indeed from our occupation of Iraq. They compare the local regimes of empire to medieval political systems, particularly the administrative relationship between feudal territorial organizations and monarchic power structures. Such forms of fractal administration are amply evident today. Post-war Afghanistan is a stark example where the so-called central government, answering to an American imperial administrator, has control mainly over Kabul, and where the rest of the country is constituted of zones of sovereignty, ruled, and still today, very much by warlords. Under such a condition, the paradigmatic spatial type that emerges as important in the 20th century, at the beginning of the 21st century, is the camp. Following Agamben, the camp can be seen as a space in which the normal order is de facto suspended. In other words, the camp is the space where the state of emergency, and thus the state of exception, becomes the rule, a permanent spatial arrangement. In this sense, the camp can be mainly different kinds of spaces. It can be the war prison, it can be the homeless shelter, it can be the labor camp, the internment camp, the refugee camp. There is, of course, a very long history to the camp, which is marginally relevant here. But what concerns me here more is the relationship between the camp as symbolic space and fundamentalism as practiced ideology. The camp is a post-city space. It calls into question the normative relationship between cities and citizenship. The camp throws a sinister light on the models by which social sciences, sociologists, urban studies folks, architects, so on and so forth, understand the city and organize public space. It is the no-law zone of the camp. In that zone, its subjects are rendered as bare life. That's Agamben's term, a beautiful term which I think is very appropriate. This is bare life as neither living in the sense that a political animal lives in community and bound by law, nor dead and therefore outside the constituting condition of the rule of law. Remember Abu Ghraib, not too long ago. If you go further back, before medieval times, we are faced with the end of empire and the disbanding of urban citizenship and of the city. Is this a moment that bears similarity to our present moment, in which it is not the city, but rather the camp that has emerged as the principal biopolitical paradigm? The Roman Empire offers a good lesson here. As the empire waned, the public life of the city of Rome centered more and more on rituals of extermination, reaching their climax in the gladiator spectacles, death in the afternoon, dramatized as a circus. Today, cities seek to deploy the strategy of spectacle in crafting a public life. Some, like Las Vegas, claim to be the greatest show on earth, as Rome was once the greatest show on earth. But the show is also morphing into a death in the afternoon. Bare life, rendered as a spectacle, displayed as hyper-reality, and brought to us live on CNN and Al Jazeera. Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib may be spectacles that mark the waning of another empire. The medieval has often been viewed not just as pre-modern, but as the anachronistic Dark Ages. In the international relations literature today, there are those who use the medieval to lament the end of the modern world order. As one IR, international relations scholar, put it, the modern era may be a window that is about to slam shut. He went on to describe that the future is neo-medieval. Robin Wright, the foreign policy correspondent for the Washington Post, wrote, in fact, a few months after the Iraq War, inquiring, and that was the headline, "Will the modern era come undone in Iraq?" She framed the moment as the final phase of modernization, taking longer to complete than expected, with the holdouts to the modern being the Middle East. Clearly, and according to this popular political view, I would say still prevalent until today, this last block of nations that have supposedly resisted the wave of empowerment and modernity that has swept the rest of the world is not the middle ground that you seek. Here, her discourse reveals how the civilizing process, as viewed by the West, is also based on a fundamentalist ethos that contends not with the historical past, but rather with the spaces of exception that are imagined to be the savage past of the East. The articulation of present-day cities, and not only in the Middle East as medieval, calls into question the inevitability of progress and the idea of progress altogether. I believe that the paradoxical phrase medieval modernity is the most apt framing of the current situation. It suggests that medieval forms of organization and community do indeed lurk at the heart of the modern. If this idea is anything, it is an attempt to trouble the teleology of the modern and to unsettle the normative concept of the city. The spatial formations that I have described are expressions of states of exception. Accepting this logic requires us to think about a post-city urbanism, where the paradigm is not the city, not even the exclusionary fundamentalist city, but rather the spatial models of the state of exception itself. Thank you very much.
Our second speaker is Hawada Al-Hariti, Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Architecture and Design at the American University in Beirut. A graduate from the Oregon School of Design, where she received a Bachelor of Architecture, Professor Al-Hariti also holds a Master in Architecture from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a Master of Arts and PhD in Art History from Harvard University. Professor Al-Hariti's recent research focuses on urban heritage with special emphasis on the theoretical debates on heritage construction, identity building, and post-war reconstruction projects in the contemporary Arab world. Professor Al-Hariti has written numerous articles, and her recently edited book published last year by Routledge is titled Lessons in Post-War Reconstruction, Case Studies from Lebanon After the July 2006 War. Please welcome Professor Al-Hariti, who will present a paper titled Religious Sites and Heritage Construction.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to interact with this fantastic crowd. The title of my paper is Religious Sites and Heritage Construction, but these are definitely terms that I would like to challenge, hopefully throughout the paper. In the paper, I will investigate examples of religious architecture in the Arab world as they are entered through contemporary reconstruction and planning schemes into a process of heritage and identity construction. This image is charged with all kinds of issues that I would love to stop by and discuss, but I will leave as my departure point in the hope that I will come back to it. The paper focuses actually on the use of religious buildings in the construction of heritage in the service of national identity on the one hand, or the tourist industry on the other. I will thus discuss contemporary planning interventions on historic cities throughout the Arab world and investigate the framing of religious monuments in these urban conservation projects. Scholars have already argued that heritage is a social construct that uses the past as a cultural resource in the service of the present. And, or as Graham articulates, the built heritage, I'm quoting, is that we have chosen to conserve from the past, end of quote. Based on the understanding that heritage is a social construct, and based on the understanding that the built heritage is a contested entity, produced by multiple authors, the paper investigates urban conservation projects as processes of negotiating heritage. Through a number of case studies, and this was meant to reflect on the idea of that which we select from the past. It's a paper I wrote some time ago. I'm just going to also leave here. Through a number of case studies, including Cairo, Riyadh, Damascus, Medina, and Tripoli in Lebanon, the paper will therefore focus on the intersection of two processes: urban conservation projects and identity construction schemes. Sorry, I'm losing track here. On the one extreme, we have examples of reconstruction of a lost past, as in this example in Riyadh, vital for the reconstruction or the construction of national identity, of which Riyadh's urban reconstruction project, called Qasr al-Hukm, is a prime example. Here, after the demolition of the old palace and mosque associated with all sorts of political events against which the Saudi government or family rose to power, the reconstruction of the palace and the mosque with a new scheme on the same site is testimony to this need to retrace or reconstruct a lost heritage, or what Hobsbawm called invented tradition. The foremost position taken by this paper is twofold. It argues that the inscription of new identities plays a major role in the direction taken by any urban conservation project, and that the manner with which the past is quoted lies at the heart of politics of identity construction in urban renewal and conservation projects. This is especially critical where religious buildings or heritage sites are key urban features that are perceived to carry the memory of the past within them. And I underline perceived. The principal methodology I use here applies the theoretical constructs that define heritage as a dialectic relationship between ownership, identity, and memory to the process of these urban conservation projects. On the other extreme from Riyadh, there's urban restoration projects that musify religious buildings. Here I'm showing examples from Cairo's very celebrated Mu'izz Street, studied with Mamluk monuments who have religious components within their functional programs. It is worth noting that Cairo was inscribed as a World Heritage Site by UNESCO as back as 1979, and that these schemes from Preservation International global models did not live up to living heritage sites and preserve them as complete entities. The Mosque of Ibn Tulun is another example of this archaeological approach to the service of the tourist industry. Its restoration was not linked to the urban plan of the area or the neighborhood around it. As a matter of fact, when I walked around Sayyida Zainab, where Ibn Tulun is located, not many people could identify it or know where it's located or can take you there. Its restoration was rendered a success as it restored the authenticity of the original style and technique, of course. But its disengagement with its immediate surroundings and context and social tales is something that needs to be dwelled upon. For today, it remains an important destination for tourists. End of the sentence. The point I'm trying to make is that cultural heritage in general and religious heritage in particular has occasionally suffered at the hands of both national and global constructs of operation, actors who claim to protect it, as a matter of fact. The position taken is that preservation or conservation efforts should not be about the internationalization of heritage, which has often resulted in a packaged frozen icons of the past to be consumed by the world public through the tourist industry, or what Hewson has further termed the heritage industry, a phenomena that has been rendered emblematic of cultural decline. Nor should it be about the nationalization of heritage, which results in the translation of these monuments into the contemporary political construct that is national identity. Here I'm operating within Anderson's definition of nations as imagined communities, of course. So a conception of heritage that is manufactured rather than constructed. The paper will continue to argue that religious heritage should remain linked to the cultural context to which it belongs, should be defined as that which is beyond the physical and visible, and should be recognized as an open process of production and transformation sustained by its rooted links to the community and its local identity. I will come back to the term local identity in a bit. This has to translate through the urban integration of religious buildings, both physical and functional integration. In Cairo, I remain, even examples such as Sultan Hassan, mosques that are restored and remain open for prayer have restrictions. Not only are these limited to the tourist industry, but often open to worship. But these in buildings were never meant to only be for worship. Only Friday prayers are performed in them, such as the case of Sultan Hassan. No other function is allowed to take place. Social practices cease. The multifunctional buildings are reduced to Friday prayers and visits of tourists, very guided, very controlled. All social spatial practices that used to take place in mosques have ceased to do so and restrict due to security measures and strict intelligence that forbids large-scale gatherings. Of course, all of this not only in the service of national identity, but national security. Limiting the mosques to religious rituals and making them sacred, removing all educational and social practices that are historically associated with them, further divorces them from communities and blocks the process of urban regeneration. A more violent rupture occurs in holy cities, such as Mecca, Medina, Karbala, and Najaf. Large-scale reconstruction projects to accommodate the pilgrims further segregate religious spaces from the city and its dwellers. Large open spaces surround the mosque in Medina, for example, which has surrounded itself with a belt of hotels and accommodations for the transient population. Pilgrims are controlled. They hardly come in contact with the city dwellers, and they come channeled through tourist hotels and bazaars. This is, of course, important as a politically motivated gesture. The spatial segregation is also a segregation of foreign visitors from the local population, wished not to be contaminated. The mutawwifs, or the guides of these pilgrims groups, are given very, very strict instructions. Actually, most of them are also foreign, and they come in with their groups, lead them through within a very prescribed path of where to go and where not to go. So to make sure that the segregation is controlled at all points. Escorting them to hosting buildings and taking them on restricted routes dictated by the state, which is all part of this national security strategy. This is especially a matter of national security after demonstrations took place in Mecca some years ago. Here's an imagined image of Medina, and one can stare here for a long time to even begin to comprehend what was going through these people's minds. As far as I know, this is hypothetical. I hope it stays so. But this imagined image still carries within it this kind of seed of segregation and belts around holy sites that create cities within cities and limited access and exclusive use. Of course, there's no public discourse around these projects. These images are not shown, debated, or put out to the public for reaction. And they remain interesting surprises. The other example, of course, that I couldn't escape showing in line of Mecca, in line of Medina, is also what is happening in Mecca. Another expansion and reconstruction project that clears major sites of the city and allows for private developers to take over the sites around the Haram and to build these high-rise, dense buildings, which I believe the city infrastructure cannot even tolerate. Needless to say that the politics involved in projects of this nature with worldwide religious significance is far more complex than what I'm even attempting to show by this slide. The dialogue established with past historic preservation and expansion projects of the sites in the service of the pilgrims is the casting of an image of this custodian state, and it's a very significant image. Tarnished these days by neoliberal-like projects of high-dense, high-rise buildings that sell rooms with a view. In many ways, this is not so different from the tourist industry and the packaging of these religious sites for world consumption. Najaf and Karbala, of which I don't have slides of, I was not allowed to show them, I understand are undergoing a similar process. There is a commissioned project in Iraq to reconstruct the center of both cities. It was commissioned to the same firm in Najaf and Karbala. To pave the way for the project, what I know is that they've already cleared all the sites around the holy grounds in preparation for the renewal project. So it almost comes now as part of the package. And again, there is no public discourse around these two major projects that are currently under study and design by a London-based Iraqi firm called Diwan, for those who are interested. But I'd like to now return to address my issues in a more mainstream examples and to continue my line of argument. Take you to Damascus as an example of a middle ground. There is the position, of course, that Porter articulates that, and I quote, by their very nature, heritage preservation projects tend to script a narrative for the nation. Unwitting actors is what he calls them. An example such as Damascus is noteworthy here, as it operates within this position. Preservation of the religious site, particularly the Umayyad mosque in Damascus here, is associated with an Umayyad history under whom Damascus was made a capital of a vast empire. It's also a reservoir of the country's historical narrative that goes back to the Roman times, thus at the center of the national identity construction. The reality is most urban conservation projects operate within the dual agenda. Damascus's religious heritage is as much in the service of the tourist industry as it is in the service of the construction of a national identity. The economy of tourism has raised real estate value, turned the local souks to orientalizing spaces with souvenirs and overpriced crafts as well as fake treasures. But the Great Mosque and many other religious spaces remain functional, at least, though host tourism. The gap, however, is growing, with the local population and their social spatial practices that cease to operate in the production of the space in and around the Great Mosque of Damascus. One is afraid that it's left to be a stage for the gaze, if not caution with these introductions of the tourist industry and its practices. We all know from the historical data and descriptions and study of Islamic cities that these mosques were integral to the cities around them, and they were never restricted to worship, but were rather social, economic, and political spaces of interaction. And I would like to identify them as such when I refer to them as religious spaces or religious sites in this paper. This rupture, this dangerous rupture between the users and the community, which is physical and spatial and functional, is a dangerous one if not controlled. This rupture with the local communities, their identity and practices, opened the door for appropriation and reclaim. A serious example is found in the restoration of Fatimid monuments in Cairo, for example. Fatimid monuments that are funded by a group called the Buhra, a religious group from Central Asia branching from the Ismaili sect, thus claiming descent from the Fatimids. Their funding of the restoration of Fatimid monuments, such as Al-Azhar and Al-Hakim, can be seen as a claim of that historical layer of the city and its artistic production. The restoration work of two fine monuments from the 10th century, such as Al-Azhar and Al-Hakim, replaced all the fine stucco work and brickwork with white imported Italian marble that emphasizes the notion of light and reflection. Notions that are, of course, central to the doctrine of the Ismailis and represent the guiding light of the Imam. Thus, an act that claimed the Fatimid history and therefore as their own heritage. The restoration work is not only technically problematic, but raises serious issues that revolve around the question of whose heritage. Particularly critical in this process is the result that divorces the built heritage from the cultural context and identity of the local social practices and its people. It raises issues of claim and reclaim, authentic and reconstructed historical narratives, all of which merely justify a group's role definition and political agenda. Of course, this case is neither a case of nationalization nor is a case of internationalization of cultural heritage, and one that reveals the vulnerability not only of the conceptual frame, but also of the implementation tools of these worldwide strategies of urban conservation, whether serving the state or the heritage industry. A vulnerability that results from disrupting the dialectic tripartite relationship between heritage, identity, and ownership. The Cairo Fatimid example also raises issues relating to the layering of a city's history and its built environment. Which layer is worthy of recovery, restoration, and celebration, and by whom? This is a negotiation of heritage that takes place and cannot be but a discriminating one, even when it comes to individual monuments. Al-Azhar, for example, is a monument built in the hands by the Fatimids and has since then evolved to a building with Mamluk and Ottoman layers, and equally evolved in function from a Shiite symbol of enlightenment to a Sunni educational landmark, rooted in today's practices as much as it is historically rooted. Therefore, any conceptual frame or implementation strategy for urban conservation projects within the context of living cities, and I underline living cities, has to accept the dynamics of cities and their monuments as an open text, in the Derridan sense of the word, that is, subject to reading, interpretation, and regeneration by their users. And by users, I mean the local community and city dwellers, in order for the process to be sustainable and to remain open-ended. Of course, this is a controversial position to take. Otherwise, it falls into the traps of the hijacking of history, the uncovering of a particular layer, the freezing of monuments and urban settings into iconic static museum pieces packaged for the tourist industry and experienced in a very prescribed fashion, thus limiting the interpretation and blocking the regeneration. I will use as my last case study, as a way of suggestion, Tripoli in Lebanon. And I try to propose an alternative through that case study. I turned to this project for the rehabilitation of Tripoli's historic city center. It's an ongoing project in Tripoli and will no doubt pose similar challenges to all of those involved within it, of whom I am one. This was made obvious as I documented the process of negotiating Tripoli's built heritage through the project for the rehabilitation of the historic city center funded by the World Bank as a major component of a cultural heritage and urban development project given as a loan to Lebanon, a $30 million loan to Lebanon. There are also other donors under whose donorship many mosques and khans were restored. The heavily politicized process involves international and local key players, agencies and experts, but hardly involves the local principal stakeholders, the local population that inhabits and regenerates the city every day. What you're seeing here is a plan proposed by the team of designers, Dips and Tabit, who are charged with the urban conservation project under the funding of the World Bank and who try to actually challenge its parameters. The very act of selection of what to restore and how to restore it is an act of historical editing. It remains, in this case, an exercise of disciplinary memory that designates monuments based on their age, outstanding physical properties, mostly religious buildings, therefore intertwined by a funding process that operates only within the public realm and public ownership. We know that World Bank funding for the Tripoli project was restricted for publicly owned land. And an economic development agenda that targets the tourist industry. Thus, a process that has alienated the local community from the very beginning in its setup, and if not corrected, is likely to disconnect the restored sections of the city from the inhabitants, which is already beginning to happen in some restoration projects. For example, most of the hammams, of which the right-hand example is one, were ceased to function. There was a decree to stop all hammams from operating due to social scandals. And they were restored into these beautiful buildings, and now they're entertaining ideas like what to place within them, museums for manuscripts, which is not the most adequate use. But this act of removing the functionality of these buildings and historic monuments is the first act of interrupting their historical process of evolution. By arguing against the frame of internationalization and globalization, and by arguing for a broader definition of heritage, an alternative approach to conservation is what I'm trying to propose here. One that does not base itself on recognition of the unique and outstanding monuments, archaeological methods of conservation, and disciplinary memory, but rather one that recognizes cities as dynamic entities whose living built heritage is produced every day by diverse spatial practices and sustained only by social memory. Social memory is based on events and associations with the place and the interaction with it on a daily basis rather than on its physical properties alone. Privately owned khans and shops that still have a dialogue with the religious buildings, for example, on daily basis, were incorporated into the overall strategy that Dips and Tabit were proposing. Here is a scheme in which they tried to use even residential units and neighborhood parts to be restored so that the economic integration between the residential components, the souks, and the religious sites is completed in a single strategy. Privately owned khans and shops that still have a dialogue with the religious buildings on daily basis were incorporated into the overall strategy. The idea was to sustain and strengthen the social practices and the ownership claimed over these historic monuments in the construction of a local identity. The approach calls for a premise that recognizes cities as the trustees of cultural heritage, and most importantly, recognizes the sustainability of city life, and that this sustainability is the carrier of socio-cultural heritage, to fine-tune the term. Thus, a call to reorient to local or regional identity as an alternative to the more ambiguous term of cultural identity or the most problematic term, national identity. Local identity is that which lies in the rooted practices, social, economic, and political, of the local inhabitants and of the everyday. An identity that emanates from living with the historic monuments and dwelling in and within them on daily basis by community members, not exclusively through religious practices, and I reiterate that. A representation of that social discourse with the historic buildings is found in an example of a soap workshop in Tripoli, and I will go back to it, or to something similar to it, in the Old City, whose stories tell the perception and the affiliation with places in the Old City. I quote, "In the corner of Tripoli's ancient souks, where his father taught him the secrets of the trade, I interviewed Mahmoud Sharkas, who was teaching his own teenage son, Ahmad, how to produce handmade olive oil soap. The family has created for 2 centuries. I quote him, "I follow to the letter my own father's methods. I'm happy just to introduce new colors and certain methods of carving the soap to diversify its forms," end of quote, said Mahmoud, seated beneath a portrait of his father dating 1940. He further noted that, I quote, "It was in 1800 that one of his ancestors introduced the technique of making soap based on olive oil and bay laurel into the Khan, then a caravanserai of Egyptian traders," end of quote. Of course, he's referring to the Egyptian Khan. This strong sense of ownership of the built heritage still operates in the local practices in Tripoli and in the local identity construction, a thread I wanted to hold on to in the conception of the new project, a construct that is still, however, threatened by turning the monuments into museum-like public institutions cut off from the daily lives of the people, these same people I was talking to, who will need, in order to access them, to pass a guarded gate and to purchase a ticket soon. When using the term local identity, I'm referring to the field of modern urban and regional planning, which, I quote, "considers local identity conservation as its main goal, thus proposing implementation methods and design strategies that are multidisciplinary and socio-economically sustainable," end of quote. Of course, any strategy like that would definitely need a public debate to be integral to it. To conclude, I would like to propose the following. We have to move from conservation policies focused on the unique and outstanding. Also, part of that is designating these monuments as religious sacred sites. That is turning them into unique and outstanding. And using archaeological conventional methods of conservation to sustainability of urban cultural heritage that recognizes the layering of a city and its open process of production, and that uses an integrated multidisciplinary method of conservation, development, and management, moving from archaeology to a multidisciplinary frame across the disciplines of economy, planning, and heritage preservation is an aim to present a general framework for local economy to thrive, to be analyzed, and for historical environment preservation within the context of a more comprehensive urban ecological planning paradigm. Finally, any economic development plan integral to urban conservation or rehabilitation has to invest in the people and support them to stay in the old cities and continue to produce its heritage, to break the boundaries between the religious, the social, and the political. If tourism is to be introduced, then it becomes an invitation to a fuller experience and an interaction with the place and its people, with the social practices of today, not to gaze upon masterpieces of yesteryears. Thank you.
Is there going to be time for discussion? I don't know. Really short, maybe.
I'd like to introduce our respondent, Kishwa Rizvi from Yale's Department of Art History. As a historian of Islamic art and architecture, Professor Rizvi's current research focuses on ideology and transnationalism in contemporary mosque architecture. In 2003, Professor Rizvi, along with her colleague Sandy Eisenstadt, convened the Yale Symposium, Local Sites of Global Practice, Modernism and the Middle East, an event which laid the groundwork for our event this weekend. The proceedings of that symposium were published in 2008 as Modernism in the Middle East. Please welcome Professor Rizvi, who will respond to the presentations we've just heard.
Use this, not the keyboard. Use that to advance the slides.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Very tough acts to follow, of course. And I'd like to thank Carla for inviting me to respond to these insightful and provocative papers. What I'd like to do is throw in a third factor to maybe bring up the idea of agency that Nizar al-Sayyad brought up, and to also perhaps talk about the idea of a lived architecture that Huwaida al-Harithi alluded to so poetically in her presentation. There are several questions that come to mind as one looks at contemporary representations of the Middle East, and we've seen many of those today. On the one hand, there are images of war and conflict in which landscapes of destruction are viewed side by side with dusty, ruinous cities. On the other hand, there are spectacular architectural fantasies that include greening the desert and constructing the world's tallest building. The region encompasses diverse geographies as well as political ideologies, and yet was united in the early 20th century with the end of colonial and imperial authorities and the rise of nation-states. The name Middle East itself, as Nizar alluded to, is historically bounded and perhaps coming to the end of its relevance. And this is something I think I want us to push the boundaries of. Already in the second half of the 20th century, alternative identities were put forth, such as Pan-Arabism or OPECism and so on, and they can go on. Islamism is the latest one. Indeed, as I suspect the papers at this conference will demonstrate, it is impossible to confine a religious practice or architectural production by either geography or even history. Yet both are at stake in this discussion. And something I'd like to do, if we have time, is to have both the speakers address this idea of history in their response to me. Architecture of the so-called Middle East, when included in surveys of architectural history, is characterized through buildings representative of a distant Islamic past. Nonetheless, some of the most exciting examples of modern architecture can be found in historic cities such as Cairo and Tehran. In the early years of the 20th century, European and American architects were commissioned to experiment in contexts that appeared to them exceptional and to actualize projects that opened up new horizons in their own practices. For local architects, modern architecture was equated with the West, and historical precedent was often marginalized in order to create what represented the new and the progressive. In both cases, that is for the foreign architects and for the local, the ideals of modernism were understood through a displacement of context and history, as though the present itself provided utopian possibilities through which social, economic, and nationalist agendas could be realized. With your indulgence, I'd like to insert a more local digression that I think is, because it relates very closely to the issues brought up in this conference, and I hope they will be. Recent debates about Park 51, the Islamic Cultural Center and mosque proposed to be built in Lower Manhattan, bring to the fore the multiple agendas and constituencies involved in the building of a religious edifice, in particular a mosque, in the United States. The center will occupy space formerly utilized by a retail manufacturer and will be a combination of profitable and public service functions. The original name of Park 51, as all of us know now, was Cordoba House, in reference to the Andalusian capital city of the Umayyads, which was founded in the 8th century and flourished for subsequent centuries as one of the most diverse and multi-confessional cities of the medieval world. Cordoba is also renowned for the monumental Great Mosque that you see right here. Built in the 8th century over the foundations of a Visigothic church and converted back into a cathedral in the 13th century during the Spanish Reconquista. The mosque remains one of the monuments of Islamic architecture, even as it serves today as a Christian devotional space. Such transfers of authority and changes in religious ideologies are not uncommon in the history of religion. Yet at the turn of the 21st century, they are fraught with nationalist politics and sectarian fears, and as is emerging through the Park 51 project. Architecture in such discussions remains as the repository of historical consciousness, serving as it does to both monumentalize belief and situate it within particular geographic and ideological sites. Although a building like Park 51 may have a singular physical location, it will arguably reference places far removed from Manhattan and moments remarkably distant from its date of construction. This mobility marks contemporary architectural practice and subverts ideas of regionalism and nationalist styles that have pervaded the discourse on architecture in the 20th century. Mosque architecture especially, and I think we're going to hear about this subsequently, also calls into question the common representations of Islam as a monolithic identity shared across centuries and continents. Instead, examples such as Park 51 highlight the trans-regional and trans-historical trends that define architecture and religion today are ones that we must address. Trans is used here by me as a prefix connoting the act of moving, quote, across and beyond, simultaneously the nation and an ahistorical conception of time. The cities that I think we're going to be looking at and have already looked at in the papers presented today are located perhaps in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, and tomorrow in Israel. Yet the architectural examples implicate countries far removed from their borders, such as the United States. The practice of architecture itself is thus transformed through the deployment of tectonic elements, historical details, and the complex biographies of patrons and designers. What is at stake, I'd like to argue, and I want to bring up, and I think the two papers presented here did eloquently, what is at stake is history, as shown by both speakers, whether in terms of global fundamentalisms or local heritage industries. Religion and architecture thus are not as divided in the contemporary world as one might first believe. Both are intrinsically invested in commemoration and at prophesizing, both looking at once to the past and the future, both religion and architecture existing like Janus on the threshold, marking the present moment. I'd like to suggest that no matter how we present the issue of time and identity, we are operating within the framework of nationalist agendas and transnational phenomenon. It is perhaps a rejection of the idea of the nation, and that's something that Nazar also brought up, of ideologies, of histories, that these groups position themselves. However, we must remember that neither local geography or identity is static, right? So when we're talking about a lived identity in the city of Tripoli, whose identity is it, and how can we ever locate it in one particular moment? At the beginning of the 21st century, the age of the singular architectural vision, indeed, and the unique masterpiece may itself be coming to an end. In fact, as we know, with Guggenheim museums designed by Frank Gehry multiplied all over the globe, from Barcelona to Abu Dhabi and now to Helsinki, and as iconic works of modernism, such as the Chrysler Building, are evoked in cities as seemingly diverse as Philadelphia and Tehran, and I'll let you decide or discover which one is which. And now in Dubai, except that of course in Dubai there are two of them, we must question what effect does this have on our understanding of the practice of architecture, or as the papers presented by Huwaida and Nizar demonstrate, what are the implications vis-a-vis our cities and how we negotiate urban space. I have several questions of the two rich papers presented here, and as I know many in the audience do too. So from the broad theoretical sweep of Nizar's talk to Huwaida's case studies, we see the role of external forces that apply pressure on the manner in which architecture and urban space are defined. The heritage industry, NGOs, urban planners bring a disciplinary focus that forces us to question the space created by architectural design itself. Religious practice in the technological age is similarly fraught by anxieties, and we see much of that in the media today. But it is also one of possibilities, and Nizar, I'm an optimist, so I hope that we can go towards that side now. Architecture may serve to elevate and to heal that which has been traumatized, and it may do so in a manner that is complex, self-reflective, and unexpected. Let me end with a few examples in which architecture and religious identities act as doubles of each other, and in which physical and temporal location is called into question. And I'll just go through these very quickly. Here, of course, we have the Jumeirah Mosque in Dubai with its architectural reference to Cairene architecture. The shrine of Sayyida Zainab in Damascus, renovated in 1993, with its architectural double, the very old and medieval Safavid renovation of Imam Reza in Mashhad in Iran. And perhaps one of the most intriguing of these mirror effects, the Kadyrov Mosque in Grozny in Chechnya, referencing the power and spectacle of the Ottomans in Turkey. For the architects of these mosques and their patrons, and I hope that during the course of this conference we will have a chance to talk about patronage and use, these buildings are not reactionary or kitsch. Rather, they are important monuments that represent history not as an esoteric concept, but as a lived reality. The believers inhabit the past as soon as they enter through these buildings, and they assert themselves within the present discourse, however we may choose to define it. They participate, that is the builders, the architects, the patrons, and those believers who inhabit these spaces, they participate in constructing and reconstructing their own belief, such is in fact the nature of religion, and thereby transgress both geography and history. In so doing, they invite us, architects and historians, to rise to the challenge of understanding the multiple phenomena that define sacred architecture today. Thank you.
So we have time for 2 or 3 quick questions. So I was going to ask our 3 speakers to come forward. Anyone have a question?
Can we perhaps let the two speakers maybe respond to each other's talks and this question that I
Certainly.
brought up,
Certainly.
if there are no questions yet? Maybe to get everyone warmed up.
Why don't you like to take a stab at this?
You start.
Huh?
You start.
I think we have our own.
Yeah,
Yes?
works.
They work? Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that Kishore actually pointed to, particularly with the Cordoba House example, which some people insist is still the Cordoba House and others insist is Park 51, there's quite a lot in the name, and quite a lot in the name that reflects the current politics. As you probably actually know, the two people who put this project together just split up very recently, about 2 weeks ago, over the name. That was one of the major reasons. The main reason that the main developer wanted Park 51 had to do with the fact that this has to do with the acceptance of American society of a mosque. One can actually say, well, this was a strategy of appeasement. One can also say, no, it's not. In fact, it is a recognition of the idea of history as a lived reality, as Kishore was describing it. What I also found very interesting is that the concept of history as a lived reality, as you articulated it, for me at least, contradicts Huayda's position of disciplinary memory. Like I kept looking at particularly Ibn Tulun, and particularly from my own knowledge of Ibn Tulun, I mean, this is a mosque that has been used for so many different purposes and has been renovated so many different times throughout its, more than 1,000-year history. To the extent that one can talk about it and say, well, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, it is renovated in a way that reflected the fact that people who live there don't know it, and that the only people who use it are those who come to visit it. Maybe that's the only way that it can survive its history, and it's the only way that it can relate to the present. Of course, I'm being deliberately provocative here to just get some of this discussion going on. But I say that too because for those of you who are familiar with the restoration project that Huayda talked about, which for many people is really horrific, what happened in the main spine of the traditional city of Cairo, starting from Bab Zuwayla going onto Bab al-Futuh, the Al-Mu'azzez Street. My particular view on it, and I was involved in some of these discourses way back in the 70s. We had a conference that UNESCO organized in Cairo in 1978, in which basically there were two approaches that divided the conference delegates. One that basically said you should restore the monuments and put all of your money in the restoration of the monuments, and the other that said, no, you have to restore the crafts, the traditional crafts and the lifestyle of people, so on and so forth, and that's the only way to preserve it. As far as I was concerned, I mean, this was a fake debate because you actually had to do both. It wasn't one or the other. Some, good preservationists know how to preserve buildings while preserving lifestyles. Knowing how things are in the context of Egypt as a nation state with major political problems today, I actually look at what happened, and I don't necessarily look at it with a negative lens anymore. Because what had happened is that these structures, which have been in dire shape to the point that many of them would have completely collapsed, have now been preserved for a future generation. Yes, of course, they don't look the way they looked before. The restoration is not authentic. There are so many elements in them that have absolutely nothing to do with what used to exist in Mamluk or Fatimid times. But so what? I mean, that is, again, the whole notion that history changes us all the time. My final comment, and it goes to, I would love to be an optimist, Kishore, but you have to give me something to hang on to be an optimist. When Kanishi Omai wrote what was then a very famous book back in the mid-90s, The End of the Nation State, I actually believed that the end of the nation state was a liberatory moment. It was something that opened possibilities. Then Francis Fukuyama came up with his thesis of the end of history. And the notion of the end of history is that we have actually reached the best form of governance through liberal democracy. And then 9/11 comes and it completely throws out that in the garbage can. Unfortunately, even though I consider myself a liberal, the only thing that I am still holding on to theoretically is the writings of a conservative writer, Russell Jacoby, who wrote this, again, beautiful book at the turn of the century called The End of Utopia, where his argument was very simple, that the future, at least the near future, of the current generation is not likely to be as good as the past. That the past, in a sense, has offered us opportunities that may no longer exist, for another century or so. And I have to say, looking at what's going on in the Middle East, despite flashes of interesting activities like what's going on in Tunisia today, I am left with very little to hang on to that is, optimistic.
So is there anything worth preserving in such a context?
I'm a big believer in that, and it's the only hope. But preserve, again, within a frame that treats history as not as this distant past, but as today as well. And to link back to your question to us about history, I think the problem that we have is this, the quotation of buildings. How we quote the past is already a frame that thinks of history as being part of the past. But for me, it's also a sign of decline in the present, that if you have to look for references in the past. In the crisis of identity and everything, I think if we are to consider as practitioners history as part of the day, of every day, then we have to allow these buildings to continue to live through the social practices within them. I don't mean the preservation of the lifestyle associated with their older memory, but to allow, through the evolution of lifestyles and people moving forward and different generations occupying and dwelling with them, to allow these buildings to also have a life of their own. And this kind of dialectic between the buildings and the spaces and the people, for me, is the only way to allow history to also reinvent itself, so we are not stuck in the past.
But Huwaida, from that perspective, then you have to accept and applaud what the Ismaili Boharas have done with the Al-Hakim and Al-Azhar. Because in a sense, they've created a community where none existed. And it's a community that may be from elsewhere, but it's a Muslim community that uses the mosque in a way that we may not necessarily, as architectural historians, like. In fact, in a way that some of us find deplorable, but they have achieved precisely what you're calling for at the social and cultural level.
But that's, I think, no. What I was referring to is practices of the local community and of the everyday that are not exclusive. Okay, because we are in living cities, which accepts the multiplicity. And the minute you identify it with a very particular group who is not part of the everyday city life, and the exclusionary practices that they impose on the monument is precisely that. It's like the history being part of the past. And they did recall the older doctrines that are associated with these buildings. They were not generating a new conception for them as a community through these buildings. Right? They were still quoting the past, which I really find problematic.
Well, what about the idea also of, and I think this is where my optimism might allow it to occur, is to perhaps allow for the change to happen within our own aesthetic judgment, right? I mean, because part of our problem with, for example, the quotations that I showed, or the kind of marble that was placed on the floor of the Al-Hakim, which was Mosed, I think, Al-Azhar. Anyway, what is this kind of preservation in our mind as architects or art historians of some sort of very pure historical past? I think in some ways we as academics place that history and impose it in a way that I think practitioners
But that's why precisely I chose to exit that mode of operation as architects and go to the multidisciplinary tools of planning, where this is the process of negotiating identity and heritage. It's not a product that is designed, but it's a process that, as long as you allow the voice of the multiple stakeholders, you ensure the sustainability of the process and not arresting time or history or function. And that's why at the end I was really alluding to planning tools rather than tools of architectural preservation, which are part of the problem. I think the tools themselves need to move forward.
Right. I think we're supposed to give space for the next speakers, and we can.
Yes, I think we have time for just one or two quick questions.
Interesting, your last comment, Hawaida, yes, about, I was going to raise the question about the role of the architect, assuming your position would be that the architect's role here is to reinterpret history. And actually in Azal's talk, the architect somehow is excluded from that, whether through the enclave or the camp or the scattered settlement. It's not really a project of architects. So if I can hear your comments on the role of the architect in both of your sort of presentations.
Well, my most recent work, I really shifted to the camp of advocacy planning. In most of the work I do stems from that frustration with architecture as a profession, that we have to allow the debates to occur in public spaces and negotiate the process with all types of stakeholders, because I'm now, having gone back to the Middle East and worked with on different projects, I see more the politics of that process than ever before. And in order to manage the politics behind these decisions made in these projects, one has to allow as many voices as possible to create a space of democracy in that thinking. Otherwise, it becomes those fascistic projects that we see all over.
This is a very good question. I teach in a school of architecture, and I practice architecture today, despite the fact that most of my production is scholarly. And I do believe it's absolutely necessary in the context of an architecture school that it should be asked and answered. Having started from a somewhat pessimistic position and having presented what I consider to be a thesis about where we are in terms of urban and political space, I still believe that there is a role for the architect. It is not, however, the same role that has to do with the architect simply engaged in practice, but it has to do with the architect being able to develop a different approach to an understanding of history. This is not about simple knowledge of history. It's not about simple knowledge of the patterns of history. It is about the capacity to problematize history for the current moment and to be able to move on from inherited structures and inherited forms of aesthetics. From that perspective, and I'm giving you a very simple answer that requires further elaboration, which we don't have time for, I advocate in much of my teaching that today I think architects who are engaged in these kinds of projects have to operate at three specific levels. The architect as an intellectual, someone who's truly informed and is not simply fascinated with the forms that he or she can study and create. So from that perspective, while I love formalism, I totally reject it because I think it's completely irresponsible at this moment. Two, the architect as an activist. And I don't believe that any architect operating in this context can afford not to be anything but an activist. The best case scenario, which is, my third option, and it has happened, with a few mayors around the United States and some other parts of the world, is simply the architect as an elected politician. I would like to see more and more of that happen, assuming that it's the right kind of architect.
Whose politics, right?
So I think we're going to end this part of the program on that note, and we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then if everybody can come back, that would be great in 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Dr. Fatih Saleh, who is professor of computer engineering at Cairo University and director for the Center for Documentation of Cultural and Natural Heritage at the Library of Alexandria. In addition to his teaching, Professor Saleh has also held the position of cultural counselor at the Embassy in Egypt, the Embassy of Egypt in Paris, and the post of Ambassador of Egypt to UNESCO. With the invitation of Professor Saleh in the spring of 2009, students from the Yale School of Architecture traveled to Cairo and Alexandria as special guests of the Library of Alexandria. So we're very indebted to him for that kind invitation. A graduate of Cairo University, where he received his degree from the Faculty of Engineering, Professor Saleh received his PhD from the University of Paris. As president of the Archnet, the Association for the Documentation and Preservation of Euro-Mediterranean Cultural Heritage, and a member of the Supreme Council of Culture and the board of the director of the Supreme Council of Antiquities, Professor Saleh's scholarly work focuses on the application of new technologies in the field of conservation and preservation of cultural heritage. Please welcome Professor Fatih Saleh as he speaks on an interpretation of historic Cairo.
How it works as a mouse. Does it work as a mouse, this? It's, no, but not,
This one.
yeah, okay, but also I want to have the mouse.
I don't think it does that. We can ask.
Just use these buttons to advance.
But in order to work as a mouse to click on something, how can I do it?
You can't.
I
Do you
can.
need to? What do you need to click on?
They can do it from upstairs, from
Sure.
there?
What do you need to click on?
No, but it's on certain on certain slides. I have to click on some parts of the slide. So
You just say into the microphone what you would like clicked on and they'll do it for you.
okay, okay. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to Yale University. And this is the first time for me to come to Yale, and I'm very happy to experience this visit and also to enjoy your snowy weather. Really, for me, it's very enjoyable because I'm coming from Cairo, and the temperature in Cairo now is 70 something, so it's different. Okay, as it's marked on the in the presentation, it's the Center for Documentation of Cultural and Natural Heritage that I'm presenting, and this center is affiliated to Bibliotheca Alexandrina. From the title of the center, as you can see, it's a center that is concerned in documenting the different aspects of cultural and natural heritage, as we will see. So as I said, we are part of the Library of Alexandria, but we are situated in Cairo, in an area that is called the Smart Village, which is a technical village, industrial area. But this is the Library of Alexandria, which is in Alexandria. And of course, what we can see here, the main building of the library is in the back, as well as the planetarium to the left and the conference hall to the right. And on the back of the building, of the main building of the Library of Alexandria, there is this magnificent wall that has different types of writings from different parts of the world. And this is very symbolic to show the integrity of human being, and that people are living, talking different languages in different parts of the world, but they are finally one human being. And the Library of Alexandria is concerned very much through carrying conferences and also through making publications on the issues of cultural heritage and development and architecture and the economics of historic cities. And Dr. Ismail Sirajuddin himself, the director of the library, is a great scholar in that. And while he was working, before joining the library, while he was working at the World Bank as a vice president of the World Bank, he made several exhibitions and several presentations about the cultural heritage and preservation of cultural heritage and economics of cultural heritage and all these issues. And also because of his interest in that and the interest of Library of Alexandria in that, they initiated the center, Archnet, which is the Center for Documentation of Cultural and Natural Heritage, as part of this preservation of cultural and natural heritage. So my presentation, as I titled it, an interpretation of historic Cairo. So because we talk much about historic Cairo and the historic Aleppo and the historic Damascus, etc., but really we have to present it to the people in order the people to know about it. So I'm talking more about the efforts that we are doing at the center in order to let the people and the visitors and the living people there know more about their city, which is Cairo. So the content of my presentation, I'll talk a little bit at the beginning about the center, and why I will talk about the center, I will come to it later. And then I'll talk about the Islamic Cairo heritage, and then the cartography of Cairo, and then some of the projects that are related to that, like Al-Awqaf projects. This is the Ministry of Endowment that owns many of the monuments of Cairo, and also Al-Azhar project, and finally Al-Mu'azz Visitor Center that we are establishing at the moment. So the center, as I said, is situated in the Smart Village in Cairo, and it's a very modern building, although its architecture is stemmed from the pharaonic architecture, which it looks like a temple. It has lines of a pharaonic temple, but with very modern lines, and maybe you can notice it has 3 pyramids on the top of the building also. Inside the building, in the ground floor, we have display areas. The first display area is what we call micro gallery, that displays on every workstation one of the projects that we are running in the different aspects of cultural and natural heritage, as I'll talk about later. And also we have another room, we call it Folklorama. It's about the folkloric heritage, and we have a good collection that is part of the major collection that is in the Library of Alexandria in Alexandria. And then we have another small museum that we call it Star Riders, that shows the contribution of Arab civilization in the field of astronomy between the 10th and 15th century, when the Arab civilization was the leading civilization at that time. And then we have a hall that we are very proud of. It's called the Culturama, which is a projection on 9 screens. And on these 9 screens, it's about 18 meters long, and it's half a circle. And we show the highlights of the Egyptian civilization across history, starting from the Pharaonic period, going through the Greco-Roman period, the Coptic, the Islamic, up till the modern times. So for the Culturamas, we normally, it's interactive, and that's how we got a patenting for it. That is a system that is panoramic with huge projection, but in the same time it's interactive as if it is one single screen. And you can choose between modern times or Islamic and Coptic period or Pharaonic period. And if you choose Pharaonic period, then you choose one of the kings, then you highlight this king, and then you go deeper and deeper. For example, if you choose Queen Hatshepsut from the time of the pharaohs, then you can visit one of her temples. This is the Deir al-Bahari temple in Luxor, and then you can go deeper in it and visit the different alleys inside the temple with explanation of things that are inside. Or you can have the Coptic timeline, and then you have the different churches and the different monasteries in Egypt. And then you can visit, an example, one of the monasteries, which is the oldest monastery in the world, because the monasticism started in this spot, which is St. Anthony Monastery, which is near the Red Sea. Or you can go, of course, inside and visit it. Excuse me, can you help me and click on the CultNet area here? Yes, thank you. Click on it. Click here, to the left, click. Yes. To the left. Enable all, yes. Thank you. Okay. Okay, we skip this. I mean, it was just a movie that about the history of Coptic heritage in Egypt and the different churches and so on. But since my computer was not compatible with the system, we couldn't make it. Okay. So in any case, and then you can go to the Islamic timeline, and then you can see all the monuments that are in Cairo, and you can select one of the monuments, like this mosque, which is Ibn Tulun Mosque, for example, and then you can go and visit it. Can you click on the bar that is underneath? I don't know, we tested it all upstairs and okay. Yes, can you do the first one, which is yeah, the first one is Coptic exhibit. Thank you. Okay. Sound. Yeah. This is a quick survey of the different churches and monasteries that are in Cairo. Thank you, that's it. Thank you. We can move to the other movie, which is Muayyid Mosque. The Muayyid here. Up. Just next to Coptic, yes. And we produce what we call 2 minutes movies about the different mosques and different monuments that are in Cairo also. So this is about Muayyid Sheikh Mosque that is in Muazzez Street. Okay, thank you. Thank you, that's enough, okay. Returning now to yes, okay. Yeah, now as you see, since we go in really the different aspects of the Egyptian cultural heritage, we recognized very easily that there is a link between the different aspects of this heritage, whether Islamic, Coptic, even Pharaonic, and also with the oral heritage or the folkloric heritage. All these things are related to each other in a very clear way to us. So this is an example, for example, of the Al-Akmar Mosque that is in Al-Muazzez Street. Al-Muazzez Street is the main street in Fatimid Cairo, which is the oldest part of Cairo. So you look very well to this entrance of the mosque. And now this is the Coptic Museum in Cairo. So look at this one and this one. So you see now the influence between the Coptic and the Islamic, how they are mingled together. And these are 2 pictures of the entrance of the Akmar Mosque from the Fatimid period and the Coptic museum, which was built in the 20th century. And also another detail of it. So this is a quick survey or a quick introduction to what the center is showing as you enter it. So the mission of the center really is to document the different aspects of cultural and natural heritage as defined by the UNESCO. So the UNESCO normally divides the heritage into natural and cultural, and the difference between them is one is man-made and the other is nature-made. And then the cultural heritage, we normally divide it into tangible and the intangible. And then the tangible and the intangible are addressing some examples like content of museums, archaeological sites, whether these sites are pharaonic or Coptic or Islamic or modern, etc., or modern architectural heritage of 19th and 20th century, which is influenced by the European style, and others. And in the intangible heritage, music and folklore and art, etc. And you see, once we are addressing this mesh of activities, then immediately we discover the fabric of the Egyptian cultural heritage and how every really thread of this fabric is very important, whether it is Islamic, Coptic, or pharaonic, or intangible, etc. So the mission of the center is the documentation of the different aspects of cultural and natural heritage as an essential step in the national strategy for cultural heritage management. And also using the latest technology, maybe as from the introduction you might have noticed that I'm originally professor of computer engineering. And we have half of our staff are IT people, and the other half are content people. And documenting the different aspects, whether tangible or intangible, and also the natural heritage. And finally, we should really not only collect information, but disseminate this information through our display areas or through our publications or through our websites. So the programs that we have in the tangible heritage, we started with archaeological map of Egypt, documenting all the archaeological sites of Egypt on a single map, or documenting the architectural heritage of Cairo. This we started from day one of the center, or the scientific Islamic manuscripts. Or in the intangible, we are documenting all the works of the musicians, Egyptian musicians. Also, we are collecting all the photos. We are putting them in what we call photographic memory of Egypt. And also, we are documenting the different aspects of the folklore. Also, in parallel to that, we are documenting the natural heritage of Egypt. We had carried a very important study that was asked by the UNESCO to do, which is a strategic approach to Egypt's cultural heritage. I'll show some parts of it. And also we have international projects with the UNESCO, with the European Commission, and with some companies. So as an example, and this example we repeat it with every program that we have, the archaeological map of Egypt, we normally start with a national map of Egypt. That's the first level. And on that level, we present every site by a point on the map and a set of information. And when you select one site, then it becomes red, like here, Giza Plateau. And then you get information about Giza Plateau and some pictures of it and some old pictures, etc. And then you go deeper, then this site becomes a full map of Giza Plateau with all the tombs and temples and pyramids of this Giza Plateau. And then when you select one of the tombs, then you go inside the tomb and visit it in a virtual reality tour, to the extent that you go to one of the walls, and then you click at any text on the wall, and you get its translation on English or Arabic. This strategy, we use it with all our programs. All our programs, you go into levels of details like that. Out of this, as I said, the importance of that is that we get dissemination of this information. So for the archaeological map of Egypt, we produced atlases for every governorate in Egypt. We have produced 15 atlas up till now, and I think we are left with 3 atlases to produce in the next couple of months. And then in the Coptic heritage of Egypt, we have built a geographic information systems that shows where all the churches are located. And when you select certain area, and then you select certain church, and then you get deep information about this church, etc. For the architectural heritage, also with the downtown of area that was called in the 19th century Little Paris, because it was built similar to Paris, all the buildings there. So we have a documentation about this area. So you select certain building and then you get information about it, or you select certain street, and you get information about all the buildings of that street. And from that, we have produced CDs, etc. For the scientific Islamic manuscripts, we are producing with the UNESCO a series of manuscripts, a series of publications that is called Contribution of Arab Civilization, number 1 in the field of medical sciences, number 2 in the field of astronomy, number 3 in the field of chemical sciences, etc. And every one of these books is in Arabic, English, and French with a CD out of it. And then for the natural heritage, the same thing. We document the different natural animals and birds and the plants that are all over Egypt. And from that, we are producing publications. And for the Arabic music, we are documenting all the works of the Egyptian musicians and singers like Kulthum, Salama Hijazi, Said Darwish, etc. And for the photographic memory, we have old collections of old photographs from 19th and 20th century, and they are divided into areas, and when you select, you make certain selection, you have a series of photos for that selection that you can investigate one by one. And the same thing for the folkloric heritage. So finally, our conceptual design, which is important to this presentation, is that we are producing maps for the different aspects of cultural and natural heritage, whether these are archaeological sites, or these are natural heritage, or this is photographic heritage, or this is folkloric heritage, etc. So that you can investigate, this is of course electronically, so that you can investigate any of these layers, or you can go vertically for one area and see all the aspects of that area. Because of that, the center now became very well known internationally, and we have some important visitors. This is the Prime Minister visiting the place. This is Bill Gates visiting the place. This is Vincent Cerf, who is the inventor of the internet, visiting the center. This is the CEO of Intel, Cisco, Mr. Kofi Annan, etc. And we have a variety of applications in all these fields of cultural heritage, to the extent that now we are producing one publication every month, because one day this line is producing a publication, another day this line is producing a publication, etc. And for that, we got some international prizes that are, so here are some examples. So going now to historic Cairo, which is our main subject, remember that there is a map that is produced by the Survey Authority in the 1930s, and since that time, this map did not change up till today. On this map, they have put all the monuments that are in Cairo, and they were 600 and something. Now, if we count them, they are a little bit less than 400. That means in about 50 years, we have lost something like 30% of our heritage. The UNESCO, in fact, we made a study for the UNESCO to put boundaries to historic Cairo, because as it was mentioned previously, historic Cairo is one of the 5 World Heritage sites that were put on the list in 1979. And one of them is historic Cairo. So historic Cairo is almost the area of Cairo. So it's really very difficult to manage as a whole city. So we proposed at that time to the UNESCO that historic Cairo should be divided into sub-areas or sub-regions that are more homogeneous and more having the same structure and same territories. So we divided it into 6 divisions that I'm going to enumerate here now. The first one is the Al Fustat area. This is the oldest part of Cairo before the Fatimid. I mean, this is when Amr ibn al-As came to Egypt, or the Arabs came to Egypt for the first time in 640s. So they were located at that place, which is historic Al Fustat, which is the oldest place in Cairo. Then after that, there is another area, which is As-Saliba and Al-Khalifa, in which the most important mosque that is there is Ibn Tulun. So that was in a later stage. And then we have El-Darb Al-Ahmar, which we are now working hard on it. And then we have Fatimid Cairo, that is very well confined by the fences that are around and the ramparts that are around. And we are working now very heavily on that. And with every one of these, we have a listing of all the monuments that are in that subsection or that subregion, with every monument, its number, and a quick information about it. And of course, we have a complete database for all that. And then we have the Citadel area, which is at the time of the Ayyubid, which has mainly the Citadel and some of the mosques. And then we have the cemeteries that was started with cemeteries of Khalifas, and then after that, it was used as general cemeteries, and it's very crowded now. Also, we are working on the cartography of Cairo. This is the oldest map that we ever found for Cairo from the 15th century. And then this is a more recent one from the 17th century. And on this one, we have identified some features that are still existing up till today, like in yellow. What you have in yellow here is the fences of Cairo, or the gates and rampart that is from the Fatimid period. And you have in green the canal that was passing through Cairo in order to take water from the Nile to the different parts, and now it's a street, which it was Shar al-Khalid, now it's Sudan Street. And then we have the Fatimid area that has, oh yes, I have here, I remember that. So this is the canal, and this is the Mu'azz al-Din Street, which is the main street in Fatimid Cairo. Fatimid Cairo is surrounded by this rampart that is located here. And then you can identify here the mosque of Sultan Hassan. You can identify here the mosque of Ibn Tulun, and Sayyida Zainab Mosque is here, etc. So we work a lot on identifying all the maps. The first recent maps that we're doing with real survey was at the time of Napoleon when he came to Egypt, and this is one of his maps. And these are some of views that were sketched at that time for Cairo with the southern minarets. So together with that, so that was a very important contribution that the center did with the UNESCO, so that we can subdivide Cairo into zones, and then these zones can have a master plan or can have a management plan in order to protect it. Then parallel to this, we had recently signed an agreement with Al-Azhar, Mashayikh Al-Azhar. So this is Al-Azhar, as you all know it, and this is the meeting that we had just a few months ago with Imam Al-Azhar, and we signed the agreement in order to produce information about the history of Al-Azhar and a website and books, etc. So we are intending to have a book about that. And also during the documentation, we discovered that in the 21st century, we are producing money bills with the figure of Al-Azhar. And also another project that we are carrying for Islamic Cairo is with Al-Awqaf project, is with the Ministry of Endowment, which owns maybe 50% of the Islamic monuments. And we are documenting all the manuscripts that they have and all the buildings that they have. And from that, we are producing a series of guidebooks about, we are starting with the Darb al-Ahmar. So these are some booklets that we are producing about the monuments of the Darb al-Ahmar. And then we are putting them all with a guiding map that takes you through Darb al-Ahmar and visit all the monuments of Darb al-Ahmar. So anybody who would like to have a look at them after the presentation, he is welcomed. And then recently, just last year, we started working on an area in Al Mu'izz Visitor Center. Al Mu'izz Visitor Center, maybe I explain to those who are not familiar with Islamic Cairo. We have Fatimid Cairo that has the main street that I was showing in the last map. That is Al Mu'izz al-Dinillah. Al Mu'izz al-Dinillah is the first Khalifa from the time of the Fatimid that came to Cairo and started building Cairo. He is the one who started building Cairo. So the main street of that area is called Al Mu'izz Street. And this is a very important street because this street alone, it has about 33 monuments, registered monuments in one street. I don't think that there is any street in any historic city that has this collection of monuments in just one street. Then we just about a year ago, we were asked in collaboration with an NGO to transform one of the buildings, of the old buildings of that street, into a visiting center in order to interpret this area, so that when you can visit this center, it's an interpretation center, you can understand the structure of the area of Mu'izz al-Dinillah and understand parts of its history. So we are located at a wikala that is called the Wikalat al-Raba. A wikala is a building that has normally 2 stories. The ground floor is normally shops, and then the upper floor is normally dormitories. I mean, for people who has the shops downstairs, they have their houses upstairs. So at Wikalat al-Raba, this is the wikala, how it looked before it was restored, and this is how it looked now after restoration. It was almost rebuilt, not really restored, but it was more rebuilt. It's for those who are familiar with the area of Fatimid Cairo, this is just next to the Al-Akmar Mosque, which is the Fatimid Mosque that we have shown. The entrance looks like the entrance of the Coptic Museum. And on the other side, we have Darb al-Asfar, one of the known streets in this area. So this is the plan of Al Mu'izz Street, of Raba, Wikalat al-Raba. And we are building on the court of this Wikala, as we see in the center, a complete model for Fatimid Cairo, with all the monuments that are there. And also, we have a micro gallery in which we are displaying different information about it, about the area. And also, we have a cafeteria that is a coffee shop, and in the meantime, it's a library. So this is an imagination at the beginning of how it looks, this court with the models of monuments there. And then now we already started building the models. So this is the Muayyid Sheikh Mosque. This is the Qalawun. And this is the other end, which is Al-Hakim Mosque. Sorry, this is Muayyid with and the first one with Al-Hakim. So it's just the opposite. So we are building bit by bit the model, and I think within 3 months it will be completed, and there will be sound and light in order to explain the relation between the monuments and the structure of the urban area around, etc. In the micro gallery, we will have different display units that shows some of the stories that were turned out into movies by Naguib Mahfouz, and also some of the handicrafts, some of the old pictures, some of the architecture of the area, etc. And in the upper floor, we will have a culturama that addresses the area, and we will have projection from the ceiling to the ground of different maps overlaid on each other to show the evolution of Cairo. In the Culturama, of course, we will talk more about Islamic Cairo more than we talk about the whole history of Egypt. And then we will have a trip in, this is a quick map of Mu'izz Street, and as you see, it's, there are plenty of Yeah, this is Al-Hakim Mosque, and this is Muayyad Sheikh Mosque, and this is Al-Ghuri is here, and then etc. So we make a kind of tour inside the street so that we can see them one by one. This is just the sketch of it, the upper third of it or the northern third of it. You have here Al-Hakim Mosque, and then you have here Salahdar Mosque, and then these are just some examples. And this is, of course, the center that we are building there, Al-Raba, Wukalt Al-Raba, and this is Al-Akmar. Now we know it very well. So as you see, Al-Akmar is just, Wukalt Al-Raba is just next to Al-Akmar Mosque, and this is Darb Al-Asfar, just beside it. And then in the middle, we have Kat Khuda Fountain, which is a beautiful place. And then we have Barkuk Mosque. And then we have Muhammad Ali Fountain. And then we have the collection of Qalawun, which is mosque and madrasa and four things, and hospital, etc. And then we have Najmuddin Ayyub. It's a very condensed place. If you have any chance to walk through this street now, it became a living museum, really. It has, as I said, 33 monuments. And then we have Al-Ghuri complex that has 3 buildings, one beside the other. And finally, we have Muayyad Mosque. So these are the same monuments that we saw, but at a bigger scale in order to identify them or to see them clearly. So this is Muhammad Ali Fountain, and this is Kat Khuda, etc. In the same time, we are documenting the living heritage in this street, and so all the activities that are cultural in this street, we are even not cultural, even restaurants, even shops, even everything. So I'm showing here 2 examples. Please, we want to display here. This is an area in the same street that called Saga, in where they have goldsmith things. No. Yeah. No. Gold. Second one up. Yes.
الذهب له مكانة كبيرة في قلوب
So you see a shop that is called Saga or Goldsmith.
من أهمها
Just has the entrance of it and just has the decoration of it in a very consistent with the street itself or with the monuments in the street.
منطقة الصاغة بحي الحسين في قلب القاهرة ورشة كبيرة لصناعة الذهب بكل مراحله، بداية من كونه ذهب خام مرورا بتسييحه وتشكيله وتلميعه وصولا لآخر مرحلة هي مرحلة البيع. هيفضل الذهب بأشكاله ورونقه ولمعانه وتصيته سر الأمان والخلود.
That's the thing I will end with is a show. One of the old buildings that we were talking about is Al-Ghuri or Qubbat Al-Ghuri that is here. And in this Qubbat Al-Ghuri, or the Dome of Ghuri, it became now a cultural center. And there is one of the shows that is done there. I believe that this is one of the best I ever have seen in my life. It's a combination, we will see 3 minutes of it only. It's a combination between Coptic singing and Islamic singing and Sufi singing and ancient Egyptian singing. So we will have a view of that now. Yes, this one. So the people that are sitting in front of us, these are Sufi singers, and this lady is representing the pharaonic heritage. And then to the right, to the left here, we have singers, Coptic singers. And this guy, he is representing Islamic young man, and in front of him there is a Coptic girl. Can you put the sound a little higher? So this is pharaonic, Coptic, Islamic. And this, of course, are the whirling dervish. Yeah, so at the end, we are trying to show how dealing with the Egyptian cultural heritage, we are trying to find out the different threads that really form the Egyptian tapestry in a very beautiful way, combination between Coptic, Islamic, and pharaonic, and oral heritage and folkloric heritage, etc. So I think if, and this show, by the way, it's sometimes labeled a message for peace, is that if the different groups understand that they can mingle together in such a harmonized way, then I think peace will prevail everywhere. Thank you very much. I have here some brochures of the center. If anyone is interested, he is welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Our next speaker is Mohammed Al-Assad, an architect and architectural historian and the founder and director of the Center for the Study of the Built Environment in Amman, Jordan. Professor Al-Assad has taught at the University of Jordan, Princeton University, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the University of Illinois, and at Carleton University in Ottawa. A graduate of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he received his Bachelor of Science and Master of Architecture, Professor Al-Assad is also a graduate of Harvard University, where he got his master's and PhD in the history of architecture. Following his doctoral studies, Professor Al-Assad held postdoctoral research positions at Harvard and the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton. Since 1987, Professor Al-Assad has been closely associated with the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, serving as a reviewer and member of its steering committee. As a scholar and journalist, Professor Al-Assad has written extensively on subjects of the architecture of the Islamic world, teaching architectural design and using computer-aided design technologies for reconstructing historical monuments. His recently edited book, published last year, is titled Workplaces: The Transformation of Places of Production, Industrialization, and the Built Environment in the Islamic World. Please join me in welcoming Mohammed Al-Assad, who will speak on the topic of mosque architecture in the early 21st century.
Thank you, Carla. The late Oleg Grabar, my PhD advisor, regularly stated that he is less interested in finding answers than he is in raising questions. In contrast, I've always found myself searching for answers. For this paper, however, I found myself confronted with a very interesting question for which I still am unable to find satisfactory answers. This question has come out of observing the evolution of the architecture of the mosque over a period of a quarter of a century in the Islamic world in general, and in the Arab Middle East in particular. I should emphasize, however, that the comments I'm about to make only apply to the architecture of the mosque inside the Islamic world, not outside it. So I'm not really dealing with what's happening in New York or in Switzerland and so on. Mosque architecture is a subject about which a number of the participants in this symposium know a great deal about. I expect I will get a range of reactions which will not necessarily be in agreement to what I'm about to present. This is to be expected. In fact, I'm more interested in receiving critical feedback for this presentation than in putting forward any definitive conclusions regarding the architecture of the contemporary mosque. In its more general terms, the question I'm confronted with addresses what seems to be a waning interest in the contemporary mosque as an architectural statement of identity. However, before posing the question in more detail, which I'll do later on in the presentation, let me share with you a few observations. Those studying the contemporary architecture of the Islamic world about a generation ago, during the 1970s and in the 1980s, could not but devote considerable attention to the mosque as a building type. In the Arab Middle East, for example, most of the region's primary architectural practitioners were actively engaged in exploring new directions for mosque architecture, attempting to address the dichotomy that existed between modern global identities and ones anchored in conceptions of the past. In addition to architects from the region and from the Islamic world, architects from Europe, North America, and Japan participated in the search. The search was supported and facilitated both by direct commissions and by competitions, primarily government-sponsored ones. The region's governments, in fact, emerged as the main patrons of mosque building. After all, they were working on solidifying and consolidating their Islamic credentials during a time of considerable political upheaval and rising religious tendencies, most dramatically marked by the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran in 1979. The experimentation in mosque architecture that took place at that time yielded very interesting and also diverse results. A number of architects throughout the Islamic world worked on developing modernist interpretations of the mosque that understated connections with historical prototypes. They rejected or greatly modified the conventional formula that had become predominant in mosque architecture. This formula may be presented as a historically based combination of forms that consists of a cube, a dome, and a minaret to the side, and I'll show examples of that, all adorned to some extent or the other with a layer of decorative motifs. In rejecting or modifying this formula, the modernist-leaning architects were establishing methodological ties at various levels of consciousness, effectiveness, and closeness, with 20th century modern masters such as Le Corbusier, Alvarado, as well as Eliel and Eero Saarinen. These masters had created greatly admired church designs that incorporated abstract, spiritual, and meditative forms and spaces that did not look to the past for guidance. Consequently, the architects of modernist mosques minimized the representation of traditional forms associated with mosque architecture, or at the minimum abstracted them. The terms non-representational, ahistorical, modernist, and abstract may and have been used to describe such directions. I expect some of you will come up with other terms. May we have the first slide, please? There are a number of notable examples of this approach. One is Jafar Touqan's 1973 Aisha Bakkar Mosque in Beirut, which we see here. Here Touqan maintains the minaret, though in a highly abstracted form in relation to traditional prototypes. However, he completely avoids the dome and develops horizontally oriented interlocking forms that navigate the mosque's irregular tight site and that significantly divert from contemporary conventional mosque forms. Another example is Rasim Badran's 1978 unbuilt entry for the King Abdullah Mosque competition in Amman. The project, which received second place in the competition, maintains the conventional syntax of dome, cube, and minaret. And this is what I mean. You have the cube, the dome, and then the minaret. The design of these components, however, avoids any literal references to specific prototypes. It instead creates highly abstracted versions, as is evident in the shape of the mosque's flat button-like dome or its space-age needle-like minaret. One of the better-known examples of these non-representational mosques is the Aga Khan Award-winning Sharafuddin White Mosque in Visoko in Bosnia-Herzegovina by Zlatko Ugljan. This mosque, which was completed in 1982, maintains a minaret, but again takes on a highly abstract ahistorical form that is independent from any past prototypes. The minaret is in the shape of an unadorned cylinder topped by a cap consisting of green metal pipes and a steel mesh. The whitewashed body of the mosque presents an abstract arrangement of sculptural elements. In Turkey, Behruz Şinici and his son Can designed in 1985 the Grand National Assembly Mosque in Ankara. This mosque breaks with tradition in a deliberate and carefully studied manner. It boldly puts forward a new prototype for mosque architecture. The mosque, which also received an Aga Khan Award for Architecture, does away with both the dome and minaret and incorporates a fully glazed Qibla wall that opens to a sunken garden. And we see that here. The overall form of the mosque takes the shape of a step pyramid topped by a horizontal cap rather than a dome. And we see that there. The presence of a minaret is only alluded to by two balconies located on top of each other with a vertical element, a poplar tree, placed next to them. And this I find very interesting. So what he has is, is just remnants of the minaret, and this is the vertical element next to them. It's a very interesting reinterpretation of mosque architecture. Moreover, the mosque presents a revolutionary arrangement on the functional level. Its women's prayer area, although located behind the men's area, is only separated by a slight difference in level, and the two are fully open to each other. This is in contrast to conventional mosques, where the two areas are more clearly segregated on both the spatial and visual levels. The most revolutionary of these abstract non-representational designs is Kamran Diba's prayer pavilion in the grounds of Tehran's Carpet Museum. In this design, which was constructed a year before the 1979 Iranian Islamic Revolution, Diba reduced the place of prayer to its essence, subscribing only to the basic liturgical requirement of orienting it towards Mecca. The structure is an abstract arrangement of two cubes open to the sky, one located within the other. The outer cube is aligned with the organizing line of the museum grounds. The inner cube is aligned with the Qibla. References to any past mosque prototype are completely absent. And here's just another image of the building. Now, in contrast to these works, a different set of approaches, which may be referred to as representational, historicist, or traditionalist, were being put forward. The most conservative or conventional is expressed in the work of Iraqi architect Muhammad Makkiya. Makkiya fully conformed to the cube, dome, minaret arrangement. He promoted toned-down historicist vocabularies that stripped historical prototypes of a good part of their ornament, or at least simplified these ornaments and attempted to capture their basic forms and lines. This is clearly evident in his Kuwait State Mosque, completed in 1986, and which we see here. A very different example of this representational approach is found in Rasim Badran's later work. Badran gradually moved away from the more abstract experiments of his early career, well exemplified in his design for the King Abdullah Mosque competition in Amman mentioned earlier. Instead, he developed vocabularies that are more deeply rooted in historical prototypes, but that emphasize what may be referred to as the vernacular rather than, quote unquote, the imperial traditions of the Islamic architectural heritage. This is most clearly evident in his great mosque of Riyadh, which Huwaida also showed us, completed in 1992. The architecture of the mosque draws clearly upon the austere, unadorned traditional architecture of the central Arabian region of Najd. And this is the interior, which shows that connection even more clearly. At the same time, a more direct historicist approach that embraced a consciously eclectic arrangement of traditions from the Islamic world's architectural heritage was being developed by the London-based Egyptian architect Abdul Wahid Al-Wakil, who's with us today. Rasim was supposed to be with us, but he couldn't make it. This is particularly found in the series of mosques that he designed during the 1980s in the Saudi Arabian cities of Jeddah and Medina. This is the Corniche Mosque in Jeddah. Al-Wakil's work initially emphasized the influence of Hassan Fathi, thus drawing upon the vernacular architecture of the Egyptian countryside. However, he proceeded to develop a vocabulary that skillfully brought together direct literal quotations from a variety of Mamluk imperial architectural traditions, such as those of the Mamluks, Seljuks, Safavids, and Ottomans. This is obvious in the King Saud Mosque you see here in Jeddah. In turn, a few internationally acclaimed architects participated in exploring new vocabularies for mosque architecture in a manner that aimed at reconciling elements from the past with the late 20th century visual aesthetic. Such a quest was in vogue during the 1980s because of the predominance of postmodern architecture. Most notable among these representational attempts is Robert Venturi's submission for the 1982 Baghdad State Mosque competition. Venturi developed a number of insightful and carefully thought out formal as well as symbolic interpretations of historical prototypes. These interpretations redefined a variety of historical elements, including the Muqarnas dome and the hypostyle mosque plan, combining them with both modern Western elements as well as ones taken from the conventional contemporary mosque, as with the cube dome minaret arrangement. And we see that clearly. He kept the, the cube, the dome, and then the minaret. And then from the inside, he played with the hypostyle plan, but kept the arches and removed the columns. As a side note, it is worth mentioning that this competition, which Iraqi architect Rifat Shah Dirji helped organize, was one of the most ambitious architectural events to take place in the Islamic world as a whole during the 1980s. It brought together a number of established architects who, in addition to Venturi, included Makiya, Badran, Ricardo Bofill, and Minoru Takayama, who died in 1986, and was among Japan's most prominent architects at that time. These architects were not only asked to develop a design for a mosque that satisfied specific programmatic requirements, but also were asked to rethink the architecture of the mosque within the context of the late 20th century. All in all, an extensive and even comprehensive narrative on the development of architecture in much of the Islamic world during the 1970s and 80s may be presented through the architecture of the mosque. At least a narrative of that architectural development definitely may not be put forward without giving considerable attention to the architecture of the mosque. The mosque, being the quintessential Muslim building type, took on a very important role in expressing and even asserting Muslim identity, an issue of paramount importance during that period. May we have a blank facade now? And so this is phase one of the presentation. I will just present some preliminary remarks and then move on to phase two. Since the 1990s, the state of affairs has changed. Calls for promoting the primacy of Islam in defining social, cultural, and political life in the Islamic world have become increasingly dominant. This has taken on a wide range of manifestations that depend on a variety of interpretations. Examples include a more widespread observance of the Muslim prayers and of fasting, the ubiquity of Islamic banking, increased calls for banning alcohol consumption, re-examining penal codes to conform more closely to interpretations of the Islamic Sharia or law, and purging the media from any content that is deemed offensive to public morality. In the visual realm, this has been most evident in changes affecting dress codes, particularly for women. Interestingly enough, during the 1960s, Western dress had become predominant in the Islamic world for men and women. Both traditional and religious attire were in clear retreat. For example, head coverings, particularly among the younger generation, were increasingly marginalized and were on their way to oblivion. Since then, however, this development has taken a 180-degree turn. Religiously inspired modes of dress have become prevalent and in many contexts predominant. This is most clearly evident in the spread of the hijab, which covers women's hair, leaving only her face exposed. To a lesser degree, the niqab, which covers the whole head, only leaving an open slit for the eyes, if that has also become widespread. The rest of the body, of course, would be fully covered with loose-fitting clothes. Such dress codes provide conscious and deliberate expressions of a return to what many view as Muslim values. While such dress codes did not exist in many parts of the Islamic world during the 1960s, they became an integral part of mainstream dress by the 1990s. Even among men, visual symbols asserting Muslim identity in one's personal appearance have become more widespread. Though less so than for women, still beards, skull caps, and long, loose shirts that extend down to below the knees have become increasingly popular among men wishing to assert an Islamic identity. These observations are supported by a personal anecdote I like to repeat. I taught architecture at the University of Jordan from 1993 to the year 2000. When I started teaching there, I had just returned to Jordan after living continuously in the United States for 15 years. An interesting expression of the change that took place during this long absence from Jordan is that while none of the women in my high school in Jordan wore the hijab when I graduated in 1978, during the 1990s, over a third of my female students at the University of Jordan did. Regarding the architectural leanings of my students at the University of Jordan, when I started teaching, many of them looked at quote-unquote traditionalist architects as sources of inspiration. These included Hassan Fathi, Rasim Badran, and Abdel Wahid Al-Wakil. By the time I left the University of Jordan in 2000, the hijab continued to define the dress code for a good number of female students. Architecturally, however, many of the students I was teaching were no longer looking at the architecture of Fathi, Badran, and Al-Wakil, but instead at the work of international architectural figures. At that time, the work of architects such as Peter Eisenman, Rom Koolhaas, and Zaha Hadid was particularly popular among my students. It seemed to me that architecture and the return to Islamic ideals had become disconnected. The state of affairs is most clearly evident when examining the role of the mosque as a building type within the overall architectural development of a Muslim region such as the Arab Middle East. For example, while religious architecture was prominent in the portfolios of the region's leading architects during the 1970s, 80s, and even a bit into the 90s, I'm thinking of Badran, Al-Wakil, Tuqan, Makkiya, etc., mosque designs are not prominent or are even absent in the portfolios of many established younger architects practicing in that region today. In cases where they have designed religious buildings, these buildings, if realized, are not among their primary works, and they do not seem to occupy any special position in defining their architectural journeys. As I mentioned above, the concern with architecture as an expression of identity, which achieved a degree of prominence during the 1970s and 80s, seems to have subsided since the 1990s. By the advent of the new millennium, it was almost completely replaced by an emphasis on positioning the region's architectural production within global currents rather than promoting a culturally and historically specific identity. For the time being, at least, it is as if architecture in the Islamic world, and probably elsewhere, is not considered among the tools that may be effectively used to define cultural specificity. This is in contrast to clothing or even cuisine, literature, popular music, or television dramas. Architecture, therefore, is treated more as a global form of visual expression that culturally has become almost as neutral as the automobile or a household appliance. This regression in the importance of the architecture of the mosque within the Islamic world's overall architectural evolution was most clearly evident to me as I embarked upon writing a book on contemporary architecture in the Middle East in 2006. Had I written this book about 15 years ago, the mosque would have featured prominently. In fact, my PhD dissertation, which I completed in 1990, was devoted to the architecture of the mosque. This book, however, that I just completed writing, and which includes a catalog featuring about 110 projects, only includes 4 religious complexes. The mosque simply does not seem to occupy a defining position in the making of contemporary architecture in the region today. True, mosques continue to be built in significant numbers. In fact, the multi-use large-scale projects I have featured in my recently completed book usually contain prayer areas or mosques. These, however, are treated more as functional spaces that house specific tasks, basically that of performing the prayers. They are not viewed as defining elements or as focal visual components for the large-scale projects in which they are located. And they definitely are not deliberate architectural expressions of identity. This brings me back to the question I sketched at the beginning of my presentation. A more clearly articulated version of that question is as follows. It's a long question, so please bear with me. Why does the architecture of the mosque, and architecture in general in the Islamic world, no longer provide as strong an expression of social, cultural, political specificity, in contrast to dress, for example, as it did during the 1970s and 1980s? And why has it instead emerged as a globalized commodity? As I mentioned, I don't have a response that fully answers this question. Moreover, one phenomenon that complicates any attempt at answering this question is that considerable diversity and experimentation, in fact, continues to be present today in the architecture of the mosque. Such experimentation, however, has retreated into the background of the architectural scene in places like the Arab Middle East. It has become overshadowed, if not overwhelmed, by a variety of secular building types, primarily large-scale real estate development projects, but also cultural, educational, and infrastructure projects such as museums, universities, and airports. May we have the next slide, please? Still, in order to provide as comprehensive an overview as possible of the situation, let me provide a selection of mosque designs that have appeared in the Arab Middle East and beyond over the past decade or so. At one extreme is the Sheikh Zayed Mosque we see here in Abu Dhabi. This building may be described as an overwhelming and overpowering example of architectural pastiche. The mosque was first conceived during the 1980s, but was not completed until 2007. It therefore spans the 2 periods of architectural development I presented above, that of the 1970s and 80s, and that of the 1990s until the present. It is essentially a collection of diverse, historically inspired architectural forms and decorative motifs, such as Mamluk, Mughal, and Andalusian, that are indiscriminately plastered together. What the project thus managed to accomplish is to dazzle the viewer by its immense size and by its extravagant decorative overlays with their rich colors and luxurious materials. Interestingly enough, it has emerged as a very popular destination in Abu Dhabi that is visited by both locals and foreigners. Now, in contrast, the London-based architect Khalid Azzam presents a far more disciplined and restrained incorporation of historically inspired architectural motifs. Azzam provides continuity with the work of Abdul Wahid al-Wakil and acknowledges his debt to him. This is evident in his King Hussein Mosque in Amman, completed in 2007. Here, elements taken from the imperial traditions of the Egyptian Fatimids and Mamluks are skillfully brought together, presenting new combinations and variations. Its limited eclecticism does not compromise its integrity. Historical prototypes are recreated with a degree of literalism, but also considerable sensitivity and skill. At the other end of the scale, a good number of architects continue to develop abstract and ahistorical interpretations of mosque architecture. One example is the Shangaon Mosque in Chittagong, Bangladesh, also completed in 2007, and shortlisted for the 2010 Aga Khan Award for Architecture. The mosque, which is designed by architect Kashif Mahbub Chaudhary, presents simple, highly geometric, whitewashed forms. It expresses a general affinity to a number of the mosques I had shown earlier in this presentation, as with the Aisha Bakkar and Sharafuddin mosques, although it avoids their formal intricacies. And there's another view of that mosque. In his design for the mausoleum complex of the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, completed in 2006 in Ramallah, Jafar Tuqan provides considerable continuity in his approach to mosque design found in his earlier Aisha Bakkar mosque of over a quarter of a century ago. However, the design places stronger emphasis on pure, simple geometric forms, as with the Shangawan mosque. The complex, which also includes Arafat's mausoleum and a mosque, and there's the mausoleum, essentially consists of simple geometric objects placed within an open landscape. The present of the past in this design is very limited, as with the calligraphic friezes wrapping around the tops of the structures. It unfortunately is one of the last projects that Tuqan completed before his health began to deteriorate over a year and a half ago. Other architects have undergone transformations in their work, moving from designing rather representational mosques to more abstract ones. This is evident in the recent work of Jordanian architect Farouk Yaghmour, who had completed a mosque design in 2007 for the famed Palm Jumeirah, which is the first of Dubai's 3 Palm Islands. This design, or the design, generally adheres to the conventional cube-dome minaret combination, though it has a modernist rather than traditionalist leanings. And this is just a view of the completed structure. Soon after that, however, Yaghmour has taken a far bolder approach to mosque design, coming up with a highly abstract composition that consists of a cube articulated by a long, slender minaret with a square section. The mosque originally was intended for a client in Dubai, but had been cancelled because of the 2008 financial crises. It is now being considered by a client in neighboring Abu Dhabi. I would like to end the second overview of mosque architecture with 2 highly daring contemporary mosque designs. Interestingly enough, both remain unbuilt. One is provided by Syrian-Palestinian architect Wael Samhouri. The design, which was completed in 2005, is for a prayer space to be located in a yet unspecified body of water. It draws upon an unlikely combination of sources. On the one hand, these include the Muqarnas vault and the 9th century spiral minarets of the 2 grand mosques of Samarra. On the other hand, they include 20th century concrete brutalist architecture and the aesthetics of computer-aided design drawings. True, there's a conscious and deliberate presence of the past in this project, and parts of it, such as the minaret, may be described as representational. The overall result, however, is boldly contemporary and puts forward solutions for mosque architecture not seen before. Elements from the past may have helped generate some of the forms used in the design, but the intention and result is to create a spiritual, abstract prayer space that emphasizes the interaction between architectural form, water, and sky. The second mosque I'd like to discuss is the 2006 Abu Samra Mosque in the Lebanese city of Tripoli by Jordanian architect Sahel al-Hiyari. This mosque is an almost completely ahistorical structure. It has a vertical element that takes on the role of a minaret, but if the minaret were topped by a cross rather than a crescent, the building would very well pass as a modernist church. Only the large calligraphic bands of Quranic text articulating the mosque's interior walls unequivocally assert the identity of the building as a mosque. From the exterior, the mosque is sheathed by a facade of tall, slender columns that hold a thin roof. This layer of columns, which Al-Hiyari refers to as a loggia, follows the borders of the site. It opens to an intermediate transitional space that surrounds the prayer hall itself, which follows the direction of the Qibla. So what we have here is this part follows the urban fabric. This part, of course, follows the Qibla, and the space in between is that transitional space. Although the forms of this mosque are completely ahistorical, Al-Hiyari's solution skillfully and creatively addresses a historical problem, which is that of connecting and reconciling 2 different orientations, that of the surrounding street street network and that of the Qibla. And now for my concluding remarks. The architecture of the mosque during the first decade of the new millennium presents a narrative that is no less interesting or diverse than what had taken place during the 1970s and 1980s. In contrast to the 1970s and 1980s, however, there does not seem to be much of an interest in such a narrative. It is not that there is any attempt to suppress it. It is just that architects and their clients in the Arab Middle East have moved their attention to other building types, primarily large-scale multi-use projects. Many clients in the region also are actively seeking designs from today's architects, every one of whom seems to be active there, particularly in the oil-rich countries. The designs of these architectural celebrities almost exclusively express the identity of the architect rather than an identity connected to place. To carry this argument a step further, let me return to remarks I have made earlier. While there is tremendous push for increasing the role of conceptions of Islam in contemporary Muslim societies, there seems to be far less interest in expressing that role through architecture in general and through the architecture of the mosque in particular. Architecture no longer seems to be considered one of the tools through which the debate on the role of Islam in contemporary societies in the Islamic world is expressed. The architecture of the mosque, through features such as size or decorative programs, may be used to express wealth and power, and very much does so, but no longer to project a significant or specific cultural identity. If anything, while architecture during the 1970s and 1980s increasingly served to differentiate Muslim societies within a global context, it now serves to emphasize similarity with the outside world. Many social, cultural, economic, and political forms of expression put forward by national, ethnic, or religious entities clearly play an important role in defining their identity within wider settings, including the global one. These activities may promote difference or they may promote similarity in relation to the outside world. Accordingly, during the decades leading to the 1970s, dress in the Islamic world primarily took on the role of emphasizing similarity within a global setting where Western values were prominent. Since then, however, dress has served the opposite role of asserting difference and uniqueness. These various forms of expression may even project a dual, and in some cases, a schizophrenic discourse that simultaneously presents both difference and similarity. Both may be equally present, or one may be more apparent or even dominant than the other. Examples of this abound in dress, cuisine, music, as well as film and television. All this is not in any way surprising, considering that the forces of cultural and political specificity, as well as those of globalization, are very much concurrently present in the Islamic world. Although it is possible sometimes to bring about a synthesis of the two, they often continue to exert pressures in opposing directions for considerable periods of time. So, as we examine this complex set of pressures, it seems that architecture in the Islamic world over the past decade to 2 decades primarily has ended up being a force promoting similarity and connectedness in relation to a global setting, while other social and cultural phenomena have concurrently expressed the opposing roles of difference and similarities. Why that is, I'm not completely certain. Thank you.
I would like now to introduce our respondent, Professor Salama Shaker, who teaches on the faculty at the Yale Divinity School. Professor Shaker was former ambassador of Egypt to Canada and Egypt's Assistant Minister of Foreign Affairs. Serving in numerous posts in the Egyptian government prior to coming to Yale, Professor Shaker was also Consul General at the Embassy of Egypt in Washington and Assistant Minister for Cultural and Education Relations and Religious Affairs and Dialogue. A graduate from Cairo University, from which she holds a degree in political economy, Professor Shaker also holds master's degrees in political economy from Johns Hopkins University and in economics from the London School of Economics, as well as a PhD in international development from American University in Washington, D.C. Professor Shaker has served as a consultant to the World Bank. She was a senior associate at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. As a scholar, her interests include peace and development in the Middle East, women in Islam, and interfaith relations. Please welcome Professor Shaker, who will respond to the papers of Dr. Saleh and Dr. Assad, as well as offer some of her own reflections on our topic today. Thanks.
Distinguished guests and colleagues, it's a pleasure to be with all of you, but frankly, I feel rather overwhelmed to be with such prominent architects, and particularly the fact that for the first time, I am seeing Professor Dr. Abdelwahid Al-Wakil. So here again, please bear with me because I'm not an architect. My husband is the architect. So as I would like very much to thank both of our speakers for their well-thought presentations that are intriguing and provoking to many comments and questions, as I'm sure will come from the floor. Before we deliberate together on the papers of Professor Fathi Saleh and Professor Al-Assad, I would like to share with you some lines on religion from the Book of the Prophet by the prominent Lebanese poet Khalil Gibran, and I quote, "Is not religion all deeds and all reflections? It is a wonder and a surprise ever springing through the soul, even while the hands hew the stone or tend the loom. Who can separate his or her faith from his actions or his belief from his occupation? Your daily life is your temple and your religion, and he to whom worshipping is a window to open but also to shut has not yet visited the house of his soul, whose windows are from dawn to dawn." From these inspirational lines, we can stem through the constructive dialogue of these open windows that welcome the religions of the world, the soul can connect and construct sustainable dialogue, since the theme of our symposium is focused on how architectural, political, and social role has evolved throughout the centuries, particularly in the Middle East, creating scenarios of dialogues and pluralistic debates among the various communities. It is rather necessary to depict how our speakers elaborated on the theme from different angles. Professor Saleh elaborated on why is historic Cairo with its Coptic and Islamic heritage so important to today's visualization of urbanism and cultural heritage, in view of the historical fact that Egypt is a multi-layered setting with layers of civilizations and religions. His paper focused on the digitalization of the old city with its Coptic and Islamic treasures and its impact on the social dwellings in the old city. Archnet is active in its role to link the past with the future while restoring monuments of Islamic Cairo from the Fatimid dynasty to the Ottoman Empire. The center is equally involved in digitalizing one of the oldest monasteries in the world, which is St. Anthony Monastery in Sinai, as part and parcel of preserving the heritage of Egypt as reflected in Christian, Coptic, and Muslim holy sites, which is the fabric of Egypt. Dr. Ismail Sirajuddin, the director of the Library of Alexandria, who happens to be an architect by training, emphasizes the importance of cultural heritage as an essential part of protecting the sense of pride and identity. He describes the language of architecture as more than form and aesthetics. It evokes the past prefigures the future and articulates the present urban reality for all the people. Siraj ad-Din outlines how the language of architecture is an integral part of manifesting a society's image of itself, while architecture are both the custodians of a past legacy. However, they are the creators of the heritage of tomorrow. These reflections are very much linked to both papers. Professor Al-Assad explores the role of architecture in the Muslim world and the role of mosques in expressing and even asserting the Muslim identity, which seems to be a wave of identity confirmation expression since the 1990s, with various calls for promoting the primacy of certain interpretations of Islam socially, culturally, and politically in what he describes as reflecting as well in the religiously inspired modes of dress from the hijab to the niqab. The paper elaborates the radical change that occurred in the last decades in some Muslim societies, which has not expressed itself in the architectural forms, in contrast to the architectural designs of mosques that have been influenced by more trends rather than the historical Islamic tradition. We will be able to address all these issues in our discussion in view of the argument that the types of architecture are established not by architects, but by societies, according to the needs of its different inhabitants and social settings. In other words, society sets the goals and assigns to the architects the job as well as how the designs are being put in together. Particular uses and needs of human beings are taken in consideration. Hence, we argue how architecture has been concerned more with exalting religious buildings from the time of the pharaohs. And then we will realize that in most past cultures and civilizations, there has been the appeal of religion as the most expressive and the most permanent and influential building in any community. From the city of Cairo to Cordoba to Jerusalem to Istanbul, architectural designs reflect the glories of these Abrahamic religions and mirrors the evolution of human civilizations and cultures. The question of how architecture designs of sacred space translate the silent language of faith into bridges among religions and cultures is an important issue in our discussion. While together we will be exploring how we can translate spirituality into an inclusive dialogue that can allow those gathered to practice their own faith and tradition, while at the same time being hospitable to people from all traditions, to reflect on plurality of perspectives and cultural cohesion. It seems that such a visionary approach is being challenged by those who are trumpeting clash of civilizations and clash between cultures and religions. However, when we look into the history of the world, Cordoba is a vivid example where Jews, Muslims, and Christians lived together in harmony. Egypt, on the other hand, was the land from which Moses spoke to God and was the safe haven for the Holy Family, which had its impact on the city of Cairo and its cultural identity. The Egyptian scholar Amin Makram Abeid emphasizes how the Copts of Egypt helped shape Byzantine art and architecture by introducing arched domes and vaults, which was adopted later with glorious effect in both the Islamic East and the Christian West. It is rather interesting to note that some most beautiful Muslim monuments, such as the 9th century Ibn Tulun Mosque and in the 14th century, the Sultan Hassan Mosque. Both were designed by Copts who lived in Egypt. These are some accounts of the cultural plurality that existed in Egypt, where churches and minarets and synagogues lived in coexistence for centuries, shaping the urban setting of the city. It is worth noting that the initiation of the preservation of culture and heritage in Egypt by centers like Archnet is based on how cultural heritage has the potential to unify mankind. And I do believe that when you are proud of your heritage, you are proud of your past and present, and will definitely look forward to a common future. Thus, calls for cultural diversity may indeed persuade groups and members of religious faith not only to value and valorize their own history and heritage, but to mobilize it to bridge cultural gaps and religious differences. The UNESCO Declaration on Cultural Diversity, which was announced in 2001 after the horrific events of 11th of September, reminded all nations with the importance of respecting the diversity of cultures, the importance of building dialogue and cooperation in a climate of cultural pluralism that would stop othering. The declaration called on civil society in a campaign of awareness aimed at safeguarding and promoting cultural diversity and establishing pluralism. The question still remains, are we closer to achieving any of these concepts? Or the facts on the grounds tell us that in spite of the scholarly attempts as presented in many national and international conferences that stressed the need of alliances between civilizations and stressed interfaith dialogue, we seem in need for more substantial, genuine understanding of the history of the Middle East in order to appreciate and promote cultural diversity. Since we have been alerted by the paper of Professor Assad that in the 1990s there is a growing assertion of Islamic identity, however, the mosque does not seem to occupy a defining position in the making of contemporary architecture in the region today. Why is that? I add that question to all the questions that Professor Assad had posed to us. Is it the impact of globalization or disinterest in focusing on the spiritual symbol of the mosque? Or is lack of understanding of the functional setting of the mosque, which was actually designed to serve the community with a space for education and learning, as well as a clinic and a space for social gathering? Is it the wealth and power and politics effects versus the religious and social function of the mosque? What about the churches? Have they too become influenced by the materialistic aspects in the societies? Another issue that I would like to raise, is there a paradigm shift by which we can anticipate that societies are drifting apart in search of identities by asserting religious differences? In her book, The Claims of Culture, the prominent scholar who is a Yale professor, Sheila bin Habib, underlines, and I quote, "We are all of us, culture-producing creatures. Thus, there is a need to realize that culture permits varying degree of differentiation between the moral, the ethical, and the evaluating criteria." These are some relevant thoughts and reflections that are very much related to our focal argument. However, since we need to find the light in the end of the tunnel, in view of the fact that culture is enlightenment and civility, can we resurrect the spirit of dialogue and tolerance and finding common grounds that can bridge the gap in understanding the core of religions and cultures in order to embrace, once again, connectivity that can promote cultural cohesion rather than cultural differences. Thank you.
Table, please. I think we'll follow the same model that we did during the first part of this afternoon, where we will ask the speakers to address each other's papers, and then hopefully that will lead to some questions from the audience.
So kindly, please, I'm sure that there are so many intriguing issues that our speakers have already posed. So we are here to get your comments and questions.
Or perhaps you have something to say to one another about your...
Probably so, yes. So, Dr. Saleh, Dr. Asad, please.
So in fact, I was really surprised by the paper of Dr. Asad in the sense it shocked the feeling that of the diversity or the difference between the feelings and the attitudes that is in the Middle East, and also the architectural design that is going around. And especially by the two last examples of the very straight architecture or very modern architecture that could be a mosque or could be a church or could be even a dancing place. So I was not really have the feeling before this lecture that we reached this stage of diversity or of divergence between the feelings of the people in the countries of the Middle East and what's going on in the architecture that is designed around them. So in fact, maybe my question is that, do you think, especially now after that we are talking now about, we are trying to limit the globalization and try to stress on the identity of the people, that there will be a reverse in the attitude of the architecture or not?
I'd like to maybe try to weave what I tried to say with some of the previous presentations. Nizar and Huwaida first, in the first session, I think they more or less talked about the commodification of heritage, although Nizar talked about other things also. And this maybe is, I mean, I looked at a very micro-specific issue, but I think there is that issue where we have various forces coming together, some emphasizing specificity, some emphasizing globalization and connectivity. But in some ways, it seems that the built world is being reduced as an element defining our identity. This is what I'm concluding, and I don't know if that is correct, that basically heritage is considered more almost something that you can quantify in terms of bringing in tourism, in terms of supporting the economy of a country. Maybe it's a valid position, I don't know. But there seems to be, from what I am observing, less of an interest in it as a gauge for identity. There's another thing, I was talking to some colleagues over lunch, my children who spend time of their lives in Canada and a part of their lives in Jordan, and people would ask me how have they adapted. And I would say, I'm not sure they really care, because the world is limited to their computer screen. And as long as that computer screen and the internet connection is available, they really don't seem to, they seem to be oblivious to where they are. And so we are really living in a world where there's so many forces, contradictory, confusing forces, that I'm not sure where they're heading. And so in some ways, I'm almost reaching out, trying to find an answer. You've given some ideas, but I'm not sure what they are, really.
if I can just link both words as much as I can, actually. I still remember that when we were in Canada, the Canadian CBS, I think that's called, CBC, I'm sorry. The Canadian CBC was trying to bring to the Canadians as much as possible what is Islam. So they came close enough by actually broadcasting series which were tailored on Little House on the Prairies. They called it Little Mosque on the Prairie, which was really a fascinating kind of depiction. And frankly, it had a lot of, I would call, constructive impression on the Canadians, who suddenly woke up to realize that they do have so many Muslims living among them. And everybody in Canada is taken to be of what you describe as, for example, if there is an Egyptian, it would be an Egyptian Canadian. And the fact that Canada actually has a governor general who happens to be from Haiti. So altogether, we can just imagine the fact that there has not been really this kind of differences. They, as Canadians, were not really feeling that. And I was in Canada after the 11th of September, and frankly speaking, I was happily surprised to find that the Prime Minister of Canada gave us, and by us I mean all the Muslim ambassadors, the Canadian Parliament, where approximately 1,200 gathered to listen more about diversity in Islam. And again, among the subject matters, it was architecture and how the architectural designs in the Muslim world were really very much closer to bring the understanding of cultural diversity. And it was the first time for me, actually, to hear that from architects who were sitting around describing and depicting, I would say, connectivity rather than really what we call a gap in the culture. So again, you know, I'm sure that you have many comments that you can enrich us with. Please.
I have a question for Muhammad. I think I'm going to attempt to answer your question. And I think the two examples that you showed us that were actually built, one of them was in Turkey, which is secular in nature. The other one was in the 70s in Beirut during the Pan-Arabism period. So it seems to me there's a link between any architectural interpretation of the mosque that is happening now and that is reverting to past historical examples that are happening mostly in dictatorship or monarchies in the Arab world versus modernization attempts that are happening or that happened during the heydays of the Arab world. So is that...
To some extent, but I'm even looking throughout the Islamic world, I'm noticing that mosque design in general almost has become a background issue. So even in more authoritarian regimes, there's less of an interest in that subject. Maybe we architects love to think that we play a defining role in determining what happens politically and culturally. But I'm beginning to think that maybe we're being reduced to almost fashion designers at this stage. I don't know.
Please, Rizvi.
You want it?
I don't have to. But in fact, Mohammed, I think I'd like to follow up on what Makram said, because perhaps the constituency that you're looking at is different. Because in fact, you know, if you start looking in any city in the Islamic world or outside, and Islamic world meaning not just the Middle East, from anywhere from Berlin to Tokyo to Ashgabat to Grozny, in fact, there's a great deal of mosque construction, and they're very large scale.
And I mentioned that, yes.
Yes, exactly. So what exactly are your criteria for judgment?
One, I made it very clear I wasn't talking about Muslims in diaspora. I think there probably architecture still has a symbolic value. Yes, so again, it's just simply an observation I have noticed that, I even repeat a comment I made. I did my PhD on mosque architecture. So in the 1990s, when I was looking for a topic to work about, it's almost as if mosque architecture was in my face right away. I couldn't even ignore it. And then I write this book on contemporary architecture in the Middle East. I was scrambling to find religious buildings. And eventually, out of 110 projects that I featured, I only found 4 that I could find more, I'm sure. But only 4 I felt really were significant enough to include. While if I wrote this book 20 years ago, probably 50% of the structures would have been mosques, I think.
What did you base in your thesis on mosque architecture?
Sorry, which?
The same question.
So what is it that for you was significant in your judgment?
Okay, I mean, of course, it depends on how we look at it. I've talked to many of the architects in the region, the contemporary architects, the younger generation. And again, I mentioned, I think of your work, of Rasim, of Muhammad Makiyas, and so on, and the mosque played a definitive role in defining your architectural direction. I talked to people like Sahel Hiyari or others, some you might know, some you might not know, and a mosque is just one of the other buildings they might get. It's just another commission as far as they're concerned.
Yes, but in your thesis, what did you come up with as the criteria to design a mosque?
Criteria to design?
To design a mosque.
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
Criteria.
No, I understand the word. I don't understand what you mean by...
What is the criteria for designing a mosque if you're doing a thesis on the mosque architecture?
The criteria for the architects?
For designing a mosque, how do you base the design of a mosque? Because I agree with Dr. Saleh here. You showed us a lot of projects which reflect the confusion that we have in our day-to-day, and not also the confusion out there, but also the confusion in the way you see the architecture of the mosque. So I'm interested to know what your thesis was based upon, the criteria of the design of the mosque.
Okay, I'll try to answer your question if I understand it correctly. When the Baghdad State Mosque Competition was created in 1982, and I mentioned that because I think it's a very important event, Rifat Shadirji looked at it more than just simply a design of a functional space. Rifat Shadirji looked at it as this is a statement as to what a religious building in the late 20th century is. So to him, it was an event. When I talk to the architects currently designing mosques, to them it is a functional building. It is there to basically support a ritual, a function, and they don't seem to be very concerned about the symbolic value of the mosque.
What is so special about the 20th century that influences the mosque? Is the religion more advanced? Our knowledge of God is now more sort of digitized, or because you talk of things like 20th century abstract. Let me tell you something. When we had the book of history of architecture at school, Fletcher, Islamic architecture, Asian, was called politically incorrectly called the non-historical styles, and they changed it in the new edition because we were out of history. But in fact, he was very right, because Islamic architecture is not based in time, it's not stylistic. Architecture, Islamic architecture, is based on truth, and if truth is timeless, architecture, Islamic, does not relate to time like Western architecture, Baroque, Gothic, according to such thing. It is based more on place and character of the environment. So it is a true environmental architecture. We spoke of environmental architecture today, but very few people know that the man who started talking about environmental architecture was Ruskin. Ruskin was the best critic on architecture. But when he came to build, he made a mess out of it. So I am very sad today that I don't have architects to sit with, because when you say Ismail Saraguddin trained as an architect, I know Ismail Saraguddin since university time. He never built a building. But when he talks, he says, to the uninformed mind. So he's always assuming he's the informed one. You cannot be informed if you cannot build the building. You don't know what the crafts are, you don't know what the client is, you don't know what the municipality is, you don't know what the site is. I don't know if it was you who criticized me on the King Saud Mosque that it was out of context. All right? Yes, it might have been out of context because all around it was nothing but, and if you go and see it today, rocket-sized buildings, like those new minarets that you've showed. But why did I do it? Why did I build there? Because the opportunity that I had a land and I wanted to do that mosque for certain reasons. One, the most important reason, because if you know about traditional architecture, its fatal blow, the dagger that killed traditional architecture, is stabbing the craftsman. We killed the craftsman. The tradition, when you talk of Egypt, the tradition of craftsmanship in Egypt came from the pharaohs. And until a recent, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not a historian, but until recently in the Muslim world, the Egyptian craftsman was renowned for his integrity in the craft, and he was sought out everywhere in the Muslim world, from Spain to Syria. He was known for his integrity in the craft, and this came from pharaonic times. And if you go, and the whole story of Hassan Fathi, when the housing ministry would not let him build, and then he found the chance from a friend from the antiquity department to build Gorna, to get the tomb robbers out of there. And of course, they inundated his project, and it destroyed his whole future, this Gorna experiment. But what is important about mentioning this is that they produced pharaonic artifacts that could cheat the experts. This is the Egyptian craftsman. That's what we killed. We talk about modern architecture, we talk about fashion. Islamic architecture is not placed in fashion and style. It's placed really in space, wherever its region. You have the carpet from, you have the Ishani from Iznik, you have the carpet from whatever village you have. Each craft was, its identity was a greater identity, not an individual identity, egotistical art that has been produced in the modern world today. Because if you read Richard Weaver, who was one of the best traditionalists of America, has produced, professor of English in Chicago, he has a chapter called The Egoism of Modern Art. And then you realize how it is opposed to Islamic art.
So I think, I think this would be a good place for us to end, because we have to reconvene in 10 minutes for our keynote address, and we will get a chance to hear more of what you have to say tomorrow. So let's thank our speakers, and we'll see you back.